Vienna State Opera House, Austria. December 14, 1987, 7:45 in the evening. The house lights dim in one of Europe's most prestigious concert venues, and 2,000 people settle into their seats, programs rustling, conversations fading to whispers. On stage, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra takes position under the warm glow of stage lighting. 38 musicians in formal concert dress, their instruments gleaming, their posture professional, their expressions carrying that particular focus that comes before a performance that's been rehearsed to perfection. The concertmaster, a violinist in his early 40s, stands and nods to the orchestra. They tune to his A note, the familiar discord of instruments finding unity filling the hall. The audience, a mix of Vienna's cultural elite, diplomatic personnel from various embassies, and classical music enthusiasts, waits with the patient anticipation that comes with knowing they're about to experience something refined and beautiful. The conductor steps onto the podium. Applause. He's Israeli, trained at Juilliard with guest conducting positions at respected orchestras across Europe. His credentials are impeccable, his reputation solid. He acknowledges the audience with a slight bow, turns to face his musicians, raises his baton, and after a moment of perfect silence, brings it down. Brahms. Symphony No. 2 in D major. The strings enter first, warm and flowing, followed by the woodwinds, then the full orchestra building into the rich, romantic sound that Brahms is known for. The music fills the opera house with precision and emotion. The violins soar through their passages. The cellos provide depth and grounding. The percussion adds punctuation at exactly the right moments. Everything sounds exactly as it should. What nobody in that audience knows, what the opera house staff doesn't suspect, what even most of the musicians on stage don't realize is that this isn't just a concert. This is an intelligence operation. Half of the people on that stage aren't professional musicians. They're Mossad operatives, Israeli intelligence officers who've spent months learning to hold instruments convincingly, to move bows in coordination with the actual players, to mime fingering while the real musicians cover their parts. Some can play at a basic level, enough to get through rehearsals without raising suspicion. Others are simply good at looking like they're playing, while doing nothing more than moving their hands and looking focused. The conductor is real. He's a legitimate musician with a distinguished career. But he's also a Mossad asset, recruited years earlier through methods that remain classified, convinced through some combination of patriotism and pressure to use his professional life as cover for intelligence work. The concert master is real. Most of the string section is real. They're actual Israeli musicians who believe they're on a cultural tour representing their country through music. They practice, they perform, they take pride in their craft. What they don't know is that their orchestra has been penetrated by intelligence officers who are using the tour for purposes that have nothing to do with Brahms or Beethoven or bringing classical music to European audiences. In the third row of the violin section, a woman in her late 20s plays with technical competence. Her name, for the purposes of this tour, is Sarah Mizrahi. She trained at the Tel Aviv Conservatory, her biography says, and has performed with several regional orchestras in Israel. Her credentials check out if anyone investigates because Mossad created them thoroughly. What her biography doesn't mention is that Sarah isn't a musician. She's a Mossad operations officer who spent 6 months taking intensive violin lessons to learn enough to fake her way through performances. She can play simple parts. She can sight-read basic music, but for complex passages like the ones Brahms demands, she's not actually producing sound. The violinist next to her, a real musician, is playing loudly enough to cover both of their parts, and Sarah is matching her bow movements to what the music requires, creating the visual impression of performance without the actual execution. Why would Mossad go to such extraordinary lengths? Why create an entire orchestra as operational cover? Why spend the resources required to train intelligence officers to mime playing classical instruments? Why risk exposure through an operation so complex that a single mistake by a single fake musician could compromise everything? The answer is sitting in Box 12 on the second tier of the Opera House, watching the performance with apparent interest while occasionally checking a program. Four men in business suits, diplomatic credentials in their pockets, representing the Pakistani embassy in Vienna. Pakistan in 1987 is racing toward developing nuclear weapons, and Israel desperately needs to know how close they are, who's helping them, and where the materials and technology are coming from. The problem with tracking Pakistan's nuclear program through traditional intelligence methods is that the network is sophisticated, compartmentalized, and operates across multiple countries with careful security. Phone taps produce limited information because sensitive conversations don't happen over phones. Surveillance of known Pakistani nuclear facilities is difficult because they're in Pakistan, a country where Israeli intelligence officers can't operate openly. Following individual suspects across international borders risks exposure and creates diplomatic incidents when foreign intelligence services notice and object. But a touring orchestra, that's different. A touring orchestra has legitimate reasons to be in multiple European cities where Pakistan's nuclear supply network operates. Musicians travel with equipment cases that could contain surveillance gear. They meet with local contacts, concert organizers, venue managers, cultural ministry officials, people who might have access to information or might themselves be targets for recruitment. They stay in cities for several days around performance dates, providing time for intelligence work that doesn't have to be rushed. And most importantly, nobody suspects a violinist or a cellist of being a spy because it seems absurd, too elaborate, too unlikely. The Pakistani diplomats in Box 12 aren't there because they particularly love Brahms. They're there because attending cultural events is part of diplomatic life. Because showing support for visiting Israeli artists helps maintain the carefully calibrated relationship between countries that have no formal diplomatic relations, but engage with each other through various intermediaries and back channels. They're there because someone at the Pakistani embassy received complimentary tickets from an Austrian businessman who has ties to concert promotion and who thought the Pakistanis might enjoy an evening of classical music. What they don't know is that the businessman is a Mossad asset, that the tickets were a deliberate placement, and that their attendance at this specific concert was the objective Mossad had been working toward. During the second movement of the Brahms Symphony, Adagio, the music becomes introspective and quiet. The strings play with restraint. Sarah, the fake violinist, maintains her bow movements and her focused expression, but her attention is elsewhere. She's memorizing faces. The four Pakistani diplomats in Box 12 are being photographed by a concealed camera built into the stage lighting system, a camera that Mossad technical officers installed during the orchestra's afternoon rehearsal when they had brief access to the venue. But Sarah is providing visual confirmation, human intelligence to supplement the technical collection. She's noting which Pakistani officials attended, how they're dressed, who they're sitting with, whether they seem relaxed or vigilant, any detail that might be relevant when analysts review this operation later. At intermission, the house lights come up. The audience stands, stretches, heads toward the lobby for drinks and conversation. The Pakistani diplomats leave their box and descend to the main floor. They're approached by the Austrian businessman who provided their tickets. He greets them warmly, asks if they're enjoying the performance, and introduces them to another man who's described as a Swiss cultural attaché with interests in promoting artistic exchanges between Europe and Asia. The Swiss cultural attaché is actually a Mossad officer, I'll call him Daniel, operating under false identity documentation that presents him as representing Switzerland's foreign ministry. Daniel speaks fluent German and passable Urdu. He's been training for this specific interaction for weeks. The conversation during intermission appears casual. Daniel mentions that Switzerland is interested in expanding cultural programming in South Asia. He asks if Pakistan might be interested in hosting European orchestras, art exhibitions, but academic exchanges. The Pakistani diplomats are polite but non-committal. They say these matters would have to be discussed through proper channels. Daniel agrees, of course, but mentions that he'll be in Islamabad next month for meetings with Pakistan's Ministry of Culture, and perhaps they might continue this conversation then. He hands them his business card. The card has a real Swiss government address and phone number that connects to an office Mossad has established through their network of assets and front companies. If the Pakistanis call to verify Daniel's credentials, they'll reach someone who will confirm his position and role. This brief interaction during intermission accomplishes several intelligence objectives. First, it establishes Daniel's cover identity as legitimate through face-to-face introduction and business card exchange. Second, it creates a pretext for future contact when Daniel travels to Pakistan, which he actually will do, because the entire point of this operation is to establish access to Pakistan's nuclear network through layers of seemingly innocent professional relationships. Third, it allows another Mossad operative, posing as a photographer documenting the evening's cultural event, to take pictures of Daniel with the Pakistani diplomats, photographs that will later be used to reinforce Daniel's cover story if Pakistani intelligence investigates him. And fourth, the Pakistani diplomats' business cards, which they courteously exchange with Daniel, provide information about their exact positions in the embassy, their contact details, and small physical markers like fingerprints that can be lifted from the cards and entered into intelligence databases. The second half of the concert proceeds smoothly. Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, followed by an encore of a shorter Israeli composition that brings the audience to their feet for enthusiastic applause. The Pakistani diplomats applaud politely. The orchestra bows. The conductor acknowledges the audience and his musicians. Everyone appears pleased with the evening's cultural exchange. And then the audience files out into the cold Vienna night. The orchestra packs their instruments, the opera house staff begins cleanup, and what seems like the natural conclusion of a successful concert is actually just the beginning of an intelligence operation that will unfold over the next 18 months across a dozen cities and 3 continents. Backstage, while the real musicians discuss the performance and make plans for dinner, Sarah and 3 other operatives embedded in the orchestra review what they observed. The Pakistani diplomat's attendance was confirmed. The intermission contact was executed successfully. The photographs were captured. The business cards were collected. The operation achieved its objectives without incident or exposure. But this was the easy part, the controlled environment of a European capital, where Mossad has relationships with local intelligence services and where diplomatic surveillance is routine and relatively low risk. What comes next will be progressively more challenging as the Israeli Chamber Orchestra takes its tour into countries where Israeli intelligence officers, if discovered, won't face merely diplomatic protests but arrest, interrogation, and potentially execution. What comes next is the real mission, the reason Mossad created an entire orchestra as operational cover, the hunt for Pakistan's nuclear secrets. To understand why Mossad would create an entire touring orchestra as intelligence cover, you have to understand the problem Israel faced in the mid-1980s regarding nuclear proliferation in the region and beyond. This wasn't about conventional military threats. Israel had proven repeatedly that its military could handle those. This was about the existential danger of hostile nations acquiring nuclear weapons, weapons that could obliterate Israeli cities in minutes, weapons that changed the entire strategic calculus of conflict in the Middle East and South Asia. And by 1985, intelligence indicated that Pakistan was racing toward developing a nuclear bomb with help from a sophisticated international smuggling network that Israel barely understood. Pakistan's nuclear program wasn't a secret. The country had been working on nuclear technology since the 1970s, officially for peaceful purposes like power generation, but everyone in the intelligence community knew the real objective was weapons capability. After India tested a nuclear device in 1974, Pakistan's leadership became convinced that they needed their own nuclear deterrent to counter the Indian threat. The program was led by Abdul Qadir Khan, a metallurgist who'd worked in Europe and had access to centrifuge designs used for uranium enrichment. Khan returned to Pakistan in 1975 and was given unlimited resources to build a nuclear weapons program from scratch. What made this particularly dangerous from Israel's perspective wasn't just that Pakistan, a Muslim-majority country with no diplomatic relations with Israel, was developing nuclear weapons. It was the broader implications of nuclear proliferation. If Pakistan succeeded in building a bomb, they might share the technology with other countries hostile to Israel. Saudi Arabia, which had close ties to Pakistan, might acquire nuclear capability through Pakistani assistance. Libya, which was actively seeking nuclear weapons in the 1980s, might buy Pakistani technology. Iran, Syria, Iraq, any country with enough money and motivation might gain access to nuclear weapons through the network that was supplying Pakistan. Israeli intelligence analysts, looking at the situation in 1985, had several most critical questions they needed answered. First, how close was Pakistan to actually having a functional nuclear weapon? Were they years away or months away? Second, where was the technology and materials coming from? Nuclear weapons require highly enriched uranium or plutonium, sophisticated centrifuges for enrichment, precision machining for weapon components, all technology that Pakistan didn't have domestically. Someone was supplying it. Who? Third, what was the network structure? Who were the key players? Which companies were providing equipment? Which countries were looking the other way while materials transited through their territory? And fourth, most critically, was Pakistan planning to proliferate this technology to other countries? And if so, which ones? The problem with answering these questions through traditional intelligence methods was that Pakistan's nuclear program was extraordinarily compartmentalized and security conscious. The Pakistanis knew that Western intelligence services, Israeli intelligence, and Indian intelligence were all trying to penetrate their program. They took extensive precautions. Sensitive conversations didn't happen over phone lines that could be tapped. Documents weren't transmitted through channels that could be intercepted. The scientists and engineers working on the program were carefully vetted and monitored. The facilities where the work was happening were heavily guarded and located in areas where foreign surveillance was nearly impossible. Mossad tried conventional approaches. They attempted to recruit sources within Pakistan's nuclear establishment. This was difficult because access was tightly controlled, and approaching the wrong person meant exposure and potential loss of the entire recruitment network in the region. They monitored communications, but the sensitive material was either encrypted or never discussed electronically at all. They tracked procurement, following the paper trails of companies purchasing equipment that could be used for nuclear programs, but the network used layers of shell companies and false end-user certificates that made tracing actual destinations nearly impossible. They coordinated with Western intelligence services, particularly the Americans and British, who shared Israel's concerns about Pakistani proliferation, but this cooperation was limited by political considerations and different strategic priorities. The procurement network was particularly sophisticated. Pakistan couldn't directly purchase the equipment they needed for nuclear weapons development because most countries had export controls preventing the sale of nuclear-related technology to non-nuclear weapon states. So they used intermediaries. A company in Pakistan would place an order with a company in Switzerland for high-strength aluminum tubes. The Swiss company would believe the tubes were for aircraft manufacturing, a legitimate use, and would export them legally. The tubes would ship to a logistics company in Dubai, where they'd be repackaged and forwarded to Pakistan. By the time anyone realized the tubes were actually being used for centrifuge construction, they were already in Pakistan, and the paper trail was so convoluted that prosecuting anyone involved was nearly impossible. These procurement networks operated across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Equipment would be purchased in Germany, shipped through the Netherlands, temporarily stored in Turkey, and forwarded to Pakistan through Dubai or other transit points. At each stage, the transactions appeared legitimate because the companies involved didn't know, or claimed they didn't know, the ultimate end use. The network exploited gaps between national export control systems, used false documentation, and relied on the difficulty of international law enforcement cooperation to operate with relative impunity. By 1986, Israeli intelligence had identified pieces of this network but couldn't see the complete picture. They knew certain European companies were supplying components. They knew Dubai was a major transit point. They knew Swiss banks were financing some of the transactions. But they didn't know who was coordinating everything, how decisions were being made, where the choke points were, or how to disrupt the network effectively. Every time they identified one supplier or one transit route, the network would adapt and find alternatives. It was like trying to stop water flow by blocking individual streams without understanding the entire watershed. The strategic concern wasn't just about Pakistan having nuclear weapons. Israel's military planners could accept that Pakistan, a country over 2,000 miles away with no direct border or territorial disputes with Israel, posed limited direct threat. The concern was proliferation. If Pakistan successfully developed nuclear weapons through this international smuggling network, the same network could supply other countries. Saudi Arabia was known to have funded portions of Pakistan's nuclear program, likely with the understanding that they'd have access to Pakistani nuclear technology or even actual weapons if needed. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was actively trying to purchase nuclear weapons capability and had unlimited oil money to spend. Iran's Islamic Republic, hostile to Israel since the 1979 revolution, was suspected of having interest in nuclear weapons even before their acknowledged program started in the late 80s. Syria, Iraq, any country with strategic ambitions and hostile intentions toward Israel might gain access to nuclear weapons through this network. This was the nightmare scenario that kept Israeli defense officials awake at night. Not one country with nuclear weapons, but multiple countries, potentially an entire region, going nuclear through proliferation of Pakistani technology. Once that happened, containment would be nearly impossible. The intelligence required to track multiple nuclear programs simultaneously would exceed any agency's capacity. The military options for preventing nuclear attacks would become limited to mutual destruction scenarios. The entire foundation of Israel's security strategy, which relied on conventional military superiority and intelligence dominance, would become obsolete. So Israel needed to understand this network comprehensively. They needed to identify every supplier, every intermediary, every financier. They needed to know the locations where materials were stored or transferred. They needed to understand the decision-making structure within Pakistan's nuclear program. They needed to find vulnerabilities where they could disrupt procurement without leaving fingerprints that would create diplomatic crises. And they needed to do all of this while operating in countries where Israeli intelligence presence was restricted or prohibited, where getting caught would mean not just failure of an operation, but potential execution of operatives and massive diplomatic consequences. Traditional espionage wasn't working because the network was too distributed and too careful. Technical intelligence wasn't providing enough detail because the important information wasn't being transmitted electronically. Recruitment of sources was too slow and too risky. What Mossad needed was a method to deploy operatives into target countries with legitimate cover, give them extended access to locations where network members operated, and create opportunities for surveillance and recruitment that wouldn't immediately raise security concerns. They needed cover that was so thorough, so legitimate, so unremarkable that counterintelligence services wouldn't give it a second look. And that's when someone in Mossad's operations planning division proposed the orchestra idea. It seemed absurd at first, creating an entire touring orchestra just to provide cover for intelligence operations. The cost would be enormous. The complexity would be extraordinary. The operational security challenges would be nightmarish. But the more the planners examined it, the more feasible it seemed. An orchestra had everything they needed: legitimate reason to travel internationally, plausible presence in major cities where the nuclear network operated, natural cover for bringing equipment in and out of countries, built-in explanation for team cohesion and coordination. And most importantly, an inherent implausibility that made it effective cover precisely because it seemed too elaborate to be fake. The question wasn't whether the idea was crazy. The question was whether Mossad could actually pull it off, whether they could create a functioning orchestra that could withstand professional scrutiny, whether they could train intelligence officers to convincingly pretend to be musicians, whether they could maintain operational security when dozens of people would be involved, many of them actual musicians who couldn't know their orchestra was an intelligence front, whether the potential intelligence gain justified the resource investment and the risk of exposure. Those were the questions debated in Tel Aviv in late 1986, when Mossad's senior leadership considered whether to authorize what would become Operation Crescendo. The meeting where Operation Crescendo was conceived took place in a secure conference room at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv in November 1986. Present were senior officers from Operations Division, Technical Division, and Strategic Planning, along with representatives from military intelligence and the Prime Minister's National Security Staff. The meeting's purpose was reviewing Israel's intelligence posture regarding nuclear proliferation threats and identifying new approaches to penetrate Pakistan's procurement network. The conventional briefing covered existing operations, their limitations, and the intelligence gaps that remained. Everything was professional, thorough, and ultimately unsatisfying because nobody had solutions that meaningfully changed the situation. Then somebody, the identity remains classified even in partially declassified accounts, proposed something different. The officer, I'll call him Yossi because that's a common enough Israeli name that it doesn't identify anyone specifically, had experience in both intelligence operations and cultural programs. He'd noticed that cultural exchanges, art exhibitions, musical performances, and academic conferences provided natural cover for intelligence activity because they involved international travel, legitimate contact with local populations, and minimal security scrutiny. But most cultural cover operations were individual, one person traveling as a visiting lecturer or artist. Yossi's idea was to scale this up. What if Mossad created an entire cultural institution as operational infrastructure? The initial reaction in the room was skepticism. Creating a fake company or front organization was standard intelligence practice, but those were usually small operations, a consulting firm with 3 employees and a mailing address, a trading company that existed on paper but conducted minimal actual business. What Yossi was proposing was fundamentally different. He was suggesting that Mossad create and operate a legitimate cultural organization that would actually perform its stated function while simultaneously serving intelligence purposes. Not a fake orchestra, but a real orchestra that happened to be run by intelligence officers and used for espionage when appropriate. The concept had precedent. American CIA had operated Air America during Vietnam, an actual functioning airline that flew real commercial routes while also conducting intelligence missions. The airline had real employees, most of whom didn't know they worked for CIA. It generated actual revenue from legitimate contracts. It operated for years before exposure, and even after everyone knew Air America was CIA connected, proving it officially was difficult because the operational separation had been constructed so carefully. If CIA could operate an airline, Mossad could operate an orchestra. The advantages became clear as the planning discussion progressed. First, touring orchestras regularly traveled to exactly the countries and cities where Israel needed intelligence presence. European capitals where Pakistani procurement agents operated, Middle Eastern cities where materials transited, Asian locations where meetings between suppliers and Pakistani officials occurred. A touring orchestra would have natural, non-suspicious reasons to be in all these places. Second, orchestras traveled with large amounts of equipment in cases and containers that weren't typically searched thoroughly. Instrument cases could conceal surveillance equipment, shipping containers for larger instruments, and staging equipment could transport technical gear that would be impossible to carry through normal passenger channels. Third, orchestras employed technical staff, roadies, sound engineers, lighting technicians who had legitimate access to concert venues and could install surveillance equipment while setting up for performances. Fourth, concert events attracted specific audiences. Diplomatic personnel attended cultural events as part of their professional duties. Business elites, who might be involved in procurement networks, frequented high-culture venues. Academic and scientific communities, including people who might have knowledge of nuclear programs, attended classical music performances. An orchestra wasn't just transportation and cover for operatives, it was bait that attracted targets into controlled environments where surveillance and recruitment approaches could be executed. Fifth, musicians and cultural workers had credible reasons to meet with diverse local contacts. Concert organizers, venue managers, cultural ministry officials, local musicians, media personnel covering events, all these interactions provided opportunities for intelligence collection and source recruitment that wouldn't raise counterintelligence concerns the way meetings between supposed businessmen and local officials might. But the challenges were equally obvious. Creating a legitimate orchestra required actual musical talent. You couldn't fake an entire orchestra because professional musicians and critics would immediately recognize incompetence. So the core of the orchestra would have to be real musicians, Israelis who genuinely played instruments at professional levels. This meant recruiting civilian musicians into what would essentially be an intelligence infrastructure without telling them that's what they were participating in. The musicians would think they were part of a cultural initiative to promote Israeli arts internationally. They'd be told the truth that their orchestra was receiving government support, which was common, but not the complete truth about why. Then you'd embed intelligence officers within this legitimate orchestra. These operatives would need to learn instruments well enough to pass as musicians during rehearsals and performances, or at least to convincingly mime playing while positioned where their lack of actual sound production wouldn't be noticed. This was technically challenging, but not impossible. A person with musical aptitude and intensive training could learn to play violin or viola at a basic level in 6 months. They wouldn't be concert soloists, but they could handle simple parts in orchestral settings where multiple people played the same line. For more complex passages, they could mime, while the actual musicians beside them covered, a technique called faking, that even some legitimate orchestra members occasionally employed when confronted with particularly difficult music. The operational security challenge was substantial. Dozens of people would be involved in the orchestra, most of them civilians who couldn't know about the intelligence purpose. The real musicians would interact with the fake musicians daily. They'd rehearse together, travel together, eat together, share hotel rooms on tour. Maintaining cover in that environment required extraordinary discipline from the operatives and careful management of what information each person in the organization had access to. The real musicians would know they were part of an orchestra. The fake musicians would also appear to be part of an orchestra, but would actually be conducting intelligence work during the tours. The conductor and key management personnel would be Mossad assets who knew the true purpose and helped coordinate operations while maintaining the facade of legitimate cultural programming. Then there was the cost. Maintaining an orchestra wasn't cheap. Musicians' salaries, even at modest levels, would run hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Instruments, some of which cost tens of thousands of dollars each, would need to be purchased or leased. Rehearsal space would need to be rented. Concert tours involved transportation costs, accommodation, venue fees, insurance, promotional expenses. Even a small chamber orchestra operating on a tight budget would cost over $1 million per year to maintain. For an orchestra that toured internationally and needed to appear professional enough to book prestigious venues, the annual budget would be several $1 million. That was expensive for an intelligence operation, but it was also less than the cost of maintaining a network of undercover operatives using traditional methods across multiple countries. The financial model was interesting because the orchestra could generate revenue. Concert fees, even for a relatively unknown orchestra, would offset some costs. Government cultural grants, available in both Israel and European countries for promoting international artistic exchange, could provide legitimate funding that didn't come directly from intelligence budgets. Private. Donors interested in supporting Israeli culture could be cultivated. Donors who believed their money was funding legitimate artistic programming rather than intelligence operations. And the orchestra could take commercial bookings for corporate events, weddings, and private performances that would generate income while also providing additional operational opportunities. The strategic question was whether this elaborate infrastructure would actually produce intelligence that justified the investment. The planning officers in that Tel Aviv conference room debated this extensively. On one hand, the orchestra would provide access to environments and people that traditional intelligence methods couldn't reach effectively. It would allow sustained operations in multiple countries simultaneously, without the diplomatic and security risks of deploying undercover operatives through conventional channels. It would create opportunities for technical surveillance installation in venues where Pakistani targets might be present. On the other hand, the orchestra's schedule would be constrained by the legitimate need to maintain its cover through actual musical performances. You couldn't just send the orchestra anywhere you wanted, whenever you wanted. You had to book legitimate concerts, which meant working with venue schedules and dealing with the normal logistics of cultural programming. The intelligence operations would have to be planned around concert schedules rather than the other way around. The decision to proceed came down to a calculation about alternative options. Traditional intelligence methods were failing to penetrate Pakistan's nuclear network adequately. Israel needed new approaches, creative solutions that gave them access to information that conventional espionage couldn't provide. The orchestra idea was risky, expensive, and operationally complex, but it was also potentially revolutionary in providing sustained intelligence presence across multiple countries, undercover so legitimate that counterintelligence services would have difficulty believing it was actually an intelligence operation even if they suspected it. Sometimes the most effective cover is the one that seems too elaborate to be plausible. Mossad's director at the time, whose identity is still protected, authorized the operation with specific conditions. First, operational security would be paramount. The number of people who knew the orchestra's true purpose would be kept to absolute minimum. Second, the orchestra would have to function as a legitimate musical organization. It couldn't be a complete facade. It needed to perform real concerts, maintain professional standards, and build genuine reputation in the cultural world. Third, intelligence operations using the orchestra cover would be carefully selected and executed only when the potential intelligence gain justified the risk to the entire infrastructure. One exposure, one mistake that revealed the orchestra's intelligence purpose would destroy years of investment and potentially expose all operatives involved. Fourth, the operation would have a defined lifespan. This wouldn't be permanent infrastructure. It would operate for as long as it remained effective and secure, then would be disbanded before accumulating too much exposure risk. With authorization granted, Mossad's operations division began the practical work of creating the Israeli Chamber Orchestra. They needed to recruit musicians, hire management staff, acquire instruments, establish legal and financial structures, book initial performances, and begin training intelligence officers to function as credible orchestra members. The timeline was ambitious. They wanted the orchestra operational and touring within 12 months. That meant recruiting had to begin immediately. Musical preparation had to proceed in parallel with operational planning, and the first performances had to be scheduled even while the orchestra was still being assembled. Everything had to look organic, like a natural initiative to promote Israeli culture, rather than a rushed operation being forced into existence by intelligence requirements. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra was incorporated in January 1987 as a non-profit cultural organization dedicated to promoting classical music and representing Israeli artistic excellence internationally. Its founding documents described high-minded objectives about cultural diplomacy and artistic exchange. Its board of directors included respected figures from Israel's cultural establishment, people who believed they were supporting a legitimate artistic initiative and had no knowledge of the intelligence purpose behind it. Initial funding came through a combination of government cultural grants, which were normal for such organizations, and private donations arranged through Mossad's network of assets and front organizations. On paper, everything looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a cultural initiative with government support and private backing, no different from dozens of similar organizations operating across Israel, which was exactly the point. The best cover is the one that isn't cover at all, but rather a legitimate operation that happens to serve dual purposes. Creating a believable orchestra required starting with legitimate musical talent. Mossad couldn't simply put 30 intelligence officers in tuxedos and send them on stage, hoping nobody would notice they couldn't actually play instruments. Professional musicians would recognize incompetence immediately. Critics reviewing performances would identify poor musicianship. Venue managers booking concerts would investigate the orchestra's credentials and performance history. Audio recordings of performances would reveal if the music being produced matched professional standards. The orchestra had to be genuinely good, or at least genuinely competent, which meant recruiting actual musicians who could actually play their instruments at professional or near-professional levels. The recruitment process began in early 1987 through channels that appeared completely legitimate. Advertisements were placed in Israeli music publications announcing auditions for a new chamber orchestra being formed with government support to promote Israeli culture internationally. The notice mentioned that the orchestra would tour Europe and possibly other regions, that musicians would receive competitive salaries and travel opportunities, and that preference would be given to younger musicians early in their careers who were looking for experience and exposure. This last criterion was strategic because younger musicians were less likely to have established reputations that would make their sudden involvement in a new orchestra seem suspicious, and they were more likely to be excited about touring opportunities rather than skeptical about the organization's legitimacy. Auditions were held in Tel Aviv, overseen by the conductor Mossad had recruited for the operation. His name was David, not his real name obviously, and his recruitment had been one of the operation's critical early successes. David was a legitimate Israeli conductor in his late 40s with training from prestigious European conservatories and experience conducting orchestras in Israel and guest appearances across Europe. His career was respectable but not spectacular. He was well regarded within professional circles, but not famous enough that his involvement in a new orchestra would receive intense media scrutiny. He'd been approached by Mossad through an intermediary who'd presented the opportunity as a combination of cultural mission and patriotic service. David was told that Israel wanted to establish cultural presence in countries where diplomatic relations were limited, that the orchestra would perform genuine concerts but might occasionally provide logistical support for other government activities, and that his role would be conducting professionally while facilitating certain operational requirements. David accepted, motivated by a combination of factors that Mossad's psychological assessment had predicted. He was a committed Zionist who viewed serving Israel's interests as a duty. He was pragmatic enough to understand that governments sometimes conducted activities through unconventional channels. He was financially comfortable enough that money wasn't his primary motivation, but would appreciate the generous salary being offered. And he was professional enough that conducting a legitimate orchestra, even one with intelligence connections, appealed to his identity as a serious musician. He wasn't being asked to fake anything musically. He'd be conducting real performances of real music with real musicians. The intelligence activities would happen around the edges of that legitimate work, and his role would be facilitating rather than executing those activities. The auditions David conducted were genuine musical evaluations. Musicians played prepared pieces and sight-read music to demonstrate their technical ability. David assessed their tone quality, intonation, rhythm, and ability to blend with an ensemble. The standards were high because the orchestra needed to be genuinely good. Over 3 weeks, approximately 120 musicians auditioned. David selected 32, a mix of strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion that could perform chamber orchestra repertoire, which is music written for smaller ensembles rather than full symphony orchestras. Chamber orchestra size was strategically chosen because it was large enough to conceal embedded intelligence officers among the legitimate musicians, but small enough to be logistically manageable for touring and financially sustainable on a limited budget. The musicians David selected believed they'd been hired for a legitimate cultural program, which they had. They signed contracts that specified salary, rehearsal requirements, and touring obligations. They were told the orchestra would rehearse for 3 months to build repertoire and cohesion, then would begin touring with initial performances in Israel, followed by European tour dates that were being arranged. Everything was professional and normal. The musicians were excited about the opportunity. For many, this was their first steady orchestra position. For others, it was a chance to tour internationally and build their resumes. Nobody suspected anything unusual because nothing appeared unusual. It was an orchestra being formed to do what orchestras do, perform music. While the legitimate musicians were being recruited and beginning rehearsals, Mossad was simultaneously selecting and preparing the intelligence officers who would be embedded in the orchestra as fake musicians. The selection criteria for these operatives were specific and demanding. They needed to have musical aptitude because learning to play an instrument convincingly, even at a basic level, required natural ability. They needed to be young enough that being in the early stages of professional music careers would be plausible, typically late 20s to mid-30s. They needed language skills because touring internationally meant interacting with people in multiple countries. They needed operational experience because they'd be conducting intelligence work in challenging environments. And they needed the psychological capacity to maintain deep cover for extended periods while living and working closely with civilians who couldn't know their true purpose. From a pool of candidates identified as having potential for this unusual assignment, Mossad selected 8 operatives. 4 would be embedded as violinists, 2 as violists, 1 as a cellist, and 1 as a flutist. These instruments were chosen because they were either numerous enough in the orchestra that an additional player wouldn't stand out, or, in the case of the flutist, positioned where slight imperfections in playing could be masked by other instruments. The selected operatives began intensive musical training in February 1987, 3 months before they joined the orchestra for rehearsals. The musical training was serious and demanding. Each operative was assigned a professional music instructor, usually a retired orchestra musician who was told they were helping train cultural affairs officers who'd be working with music programs as part of diplomatic assignments. This explanation was plausible because governments do send diplomats with arts backgrounds to cultural attaché positions, and basic musical competence would be useful in such roles. The instructors taught fundamentals of their instruments, proper posture, hand position, bow technique for string players, breath control for wind players, how to read music, how to practice effectively. The operatives practiced multiple hours daily because learning an instrument requires both technical skill and muscle memory that only develops through repetition. By April, the operatives could play at what instructors described as enthusiastic amateur level. They could read simple music, execute basic techniques, and produce acceptable tone quality when playing pieces within their limited technical range. They weren't concert musicians, but they could function in an orchestra setting if positioned carefully and given music that matched their abilities. The next phase of training involved learning to fake playing during passages that exceeded their skill level. This required understanding how to move their hands and arms in ways that looked like playing without actually producing sound, or producing sound so quietly that it disappeared within the orchestral texture. String players learned to minimize bow pressure, so their instruments would barely vibrate while their movements looked normal. Wind players learned to finger correctly while controlling their breath to produce minimal sound. The skill was matching visual appearance with minimal audio contribution, letting other musicians carry the musical line while appearing to participate. In May 1987, the 8 operatives joined the Israeli Chamber Orchestra. They were introduced to the other musicians as new hires who'd auditioned privately due to schedule conflicts with the main audition period. This explanation was accepted without question because orchestra membership does sometimes change even after initial formation, and private auditions aren't unusual for established musicians. The operatives were positioned strategically within the orchestra sections. The 4 fake violinists were placed in the back rows of the violin sections where small errors would be less noticeable and where the stronger players in front rows would cover any imperfections. The 2 fake violists sat among 3 legitimate violists, positioned where their parts would blend. The fake cellist was surrounded by 3 real cellists who could carry the section. The fake flutist was part of a small woodwind section where subtle playing or occasional miming would be masked by other instruments. Rehearsals revealed the challenges of maintaining this deception. During the first full orchestra rehearsal, David the conductor noticed immediately that several musicians weren't producing the sound quality he expected. The fake violinists were tentative and rhythmically behind. The fake violist struggled with intonation. But David knew who these musicians were and what their actual purpose was, so he worked around it. He'd assign them simplified versions of difficult passages. He'd position microphones for concerts to emphasize sections where legitimate musicians played and minimize sections where operatives sat. He'd program repertoire that played to the orchestra's actual strengths rather than exposing weaknesses. The legitimate musicians noticed that some of their colleagues weren't as skilled as expected, but this isn't uncommon in newly formed orchestras. Musical abilities vary, and weaker players sometimes improve with time and experience, so the legitimate musicians generally just accepted it as normal variation in ensemble quality. The psychological challenge for the operatives was maintaining their cover continuously while living double lives. They had to be friendly and collegial with civilian musicians who believed they were fellow orchestra members. They attended rehearsals, participated in sectional practices where small groups worked on specific passages, joined social activities where orchestra members bonded over meals and drinks after rehearsals. They had to remember their cover identities consistently, their fabricated backgrounds as music students at various conservatories, their fictional career histories, their personal stories that explained who they were and why they'd become musicians. One operative later described it as exhausting, constantly monitoring every word to ensure nothing contradicted the cover identity, never being able to relax completely, even during off hours, because maintaining relationships with civilian musicians required sustained performance. While the orchestra rehearsed and prepared musically, Mossad's technical division was developing the specialized equipment that would be used during operational deployments. Instrument cases were modified to contain hidden compartments where surveillance gear could be concealed. A violin case might have a false bottom containing a miniature camera. A cello case might have a concealed space containing recording equipment. These modifications were sophisticated enough that casual inspection wouldn't reveal them, and even professional security screening would likely miss them unless specifically looking for espionage equipment, which security at concert venues typically wasn't. The orchestra's equipment transport containers, large cases used to ship music stands, larger instruments, and staging equipment, were modified to contain more substantial gear, including communications equipment and technical surveillance devices that would be installed in venues during concert setup. The orchestra's management structure was entirely controlled by Mossad. The executive director, officially responsible for booking concerts and managing logistics, was a Mossad operations officer with extensive experience in cultural cover operations. The tour manager, who handled travel arrangements and on-site coordination, was another Mossad officer with language skills and regional expertise. The orchestra's financial controller, managing budgets and payments, was a Mossad finance specialist who ensured operational funds flowed through channels that appeared legitimate while actually being supplied by intelligence budgets laundered through cultural grants and front organizations. Even the orchestra's publicist, responsible for media relations and promotional materials, was a Mossad asset who controlled what information about the orchestra reached the public. By June 1987, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra was ready for its first public performances. These initial concerts were scheduled in Israel, specifically in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. The purpose was establishing credibility through local performances that would be reviewed by Israeli music critics and attended by cultural audiences who'd provide feedback and word of mouth. The concerts had to be genuinely good because Israeli audiences included sophisticated classical music enthusiasts who'd recognize incompetence. The programs were carefully selected to showcase the orchestra's strengths, while avoiding music that would expose the limitations of the embedded operatives. The reviews were generally positive. Critics noted that the new Israeli Chamber Orchestra showed promise, that the performance quality was respectable, if not exceptional, and that the ensemble demonstrated good cohesion for a newly formed group. A couple of critics mentioned that some sections seemed uneven, but this was attributed to the orchestra being in its early development phase. The performances were recorded, and those recordings became promotional material used when booking future concerts. Photographs from the performances were used in promotional brochures and media materials. Everything was building the legitimate public face of an orchestra that appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a cultural initiative promoting Israeli music internationally. Behind this legitimate facade, Mossad was planning the orchestra's first operational deployment, the Vienna concert that would take place in December. The concert booking was arranged through a European music agency that specialized in promoting cultural exchanges. The agency was told the Israeli Chamber Orchestra was looking for European venues as part of an international tour building their profile. Vienna was selected specifically because Pakistani diplomatic personnel were known to frequent cultural events there, and Mossad had specific intelligence targets they wanted to surveil. The concert would serve dual purposes, a legitimate musical performance and an intelligence operation, with most of the orchestra members knowing only about the former, while 8 embedded operatives and key management personnel executed the latter. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra arrived in Vienna on December 12, 1987, 2 days before their scheduled performance at the State Opera House. The civilian musicians were excited about performing in one of Europe's most prestigious venues, a location where legendary conductors and orchestras had performed for over a century. They checked into their hotel, a comfortable mid-range property near the city center, and spent the afternoon exploring Vienna's winter streets, visiting cafes, and discussing the upcoming concert with the nervous anticipation that musicians feel before important performances. For them, this was a significant career milestone, performing in Vienna. being part of something that elevated their professional profiles. They had no idea that the concert they were preparing for was designed primarily as cover for an intelligence operation targeting Pakistan's nuclear procurement network. For the 8 embedded operatives, arrival in Vienna triggered a shift from the routine of rehearsals and preparation into operational mode. They'd spent months training musically and building cover identities, but this was their first actual intelligence deployment using the orchestra infrastructure. The transition required psychological adjustment, moving from the relatively safe environment of practicing in Tel Aviv to operating in a foreign city where exposure could compromise not just their individual covers, but the entire operation. They maintained their roles as musicians, participating in the group activities, chatting with civilian colleagues, appearing relaxed and enthusiastic. But internally, they were running through operational protocols, reviewing contingency plans, and preparing mentally for what would happen over the next 72 hours. The day after arrival, the orchestra had a scheduled rehearsal at the Vienna State Opera House. This wasn't unusual for touring orchestras, having access to the performance venue beforehand to adjust to the acoustics and familiarize themselves with the stage layout. The civilian musicians appreciated this because different halls have different acoustic properties that affect how you play. Some venues are so resonant that you have to play with more restraint to avoid sounding muddy. Others are acoustically dry, requiring more energy to fill the space with sound. Vienna's Opera House was known for being acoustically generous. The sound carried well, which meant the orchestra could play with slightly less volume and still achieve full effect. What the civilian musicians didn't notice during the rehearsal was that while they were focused on music, the operatives and certain management staff were conducting surveillance mapping of the venue. One of the fake violinists, during a break when musicians were resting between pieces, walked around the hall photographing sightlines with a camera concealed in what appeared to be a smartphone, though in 1987 this would have been less common technology. The tour manager, a Mossad officer, spent the rehearsal observing security camera positions, noting which areas of the building had surveillance coverage and which didn't. The orchestra's technical crew, which included 2 additional Mossad operatives whose official role was managing sound equipment, used their access to install a miniature camera in the lighting system above Box 12 on the second tier, the box where Pakistani diplomats would be seated during the performance. The camera installation was executed during what appeared to be routine adjustment of stage lighting. The technical crew had legitimate access to lighting equipment as part of their job setting up for the concert. They used ladders to reach the lighting rig, ostensibly to adjust angles and test illumination levels. While doing this visible work, one operative attached a device about the size of a matchbox to the structural framework near a spotlight that would illuminate Box 12 during the performance. The device was a miniature video camera with a wireless transmitter, powered by a small battery that would last approximately 6 hours, more than enough for the evening's concert. The camera was positioned to capture faces of anyone sitting in that specific box, with image quality sufficient for facial recognition software analysis. The evening of December 14th arrived with the typical pre-performance atmosphere of anticipation and nervous energy. The musicians arrived at the Opera House early, some warming up in practice rooms, others preparing mentally in the green room, drinking coffee or tea, reviewing difficult passages in the music one more time. David, the conductor, gave a brief, encouraging speech about representing Israeli culture with excellence, about making this Vienna performance something to be proud of. The civilian musicians felt inspired by his words. The operatives appreciated that his speech, while genuine in its musical content, also served as coded confirmation that the operational aspects were proceeding as planned. The house opened at 7 o'clock. The audience began arriving, well-dressed Viennese culture enthusiasts, diplomatic personnel, music critics, the typical demographic for classical concerts in European capitals. At approximately 7:20, 4 men entered the Opera House lobby, presented tickets for Box 12, and were escorted to their seats by venue staff. These were the Pakistani diplomatic personnel that Israeli intelligence had been tracking, officials from Pakistan's embassy in Vienna, whose positions gave them access to information about procurement activities and whose patterns suggested possible involvement in or knowledge of the nuclear supply network. Their attendance at this specific concert wasn't coincidental. The complimentary tickets they'd received had been orchestrated through a Mossad asset. The Austrian businessman who'd approached them during intermission would later be revealed as another intelligence officer. At 7:45, the house lights dimmed. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra took the stage to polite applause. They tuned, the familiar sound of instruments adjusting to match pitch filling the hall. David stepped onto the podium, acknowledged the audience, turned to his musicians and raised his baton. The concert began. Brahms' Symphony No. 2 in D major flowed from the orchestra with the warm, romantic sound that makes Brahms beloved by classical music audiences. The legitimate musicians played with concentration and skill, aware that performing in this prestigious venue required their best effort. The fake musicians played what they could and faked the rest, their limitations masked by the stronger players around them and by David's strategic positioning and dynamic balance that ensured their sections weren't exposed. While the music filled the hall, Sarah, one of the fake violinists, was executing her intelligence assignment. Her primary task during the performance was visual surveillance of the Pakistani diplomats in Box 12. She'd positioned herself in the violin section, where she could see the box while appearing to focus on her music. Between passages, during moments when her part was rests and she wasn't supposed to be playing anyway, she'd glance up and observe the Pakistani officials, noting their body language, whether they seemed focused on the music or distracted, whether they were speaking to each other during the performance. She was memorizing details that would be included in her operational report after the concert, which Pakistani officials seemed senior based on seating position and deference from others, whether any of them appeared nervous or vigilant in ways that might suggest security consciousness. The concealed camera positioned above Box 12 was capturing video footage throughout the performance. The signal was being transmitted to a receiver in a nearby hotel room that Mossad had rented for operational support. 2 intelligence officers in that room were monitoring the video feed, recording everything, and running preliminary analysis while the concert was happening. They were capturing clear facial images of all 4 Pakistani diplomats, images that would be run through facial recognition databases to confirm identities and cross-referenced with other intelligence holdings to identify any additional information about these individuals' roles and activities. At intermission, the house lights came up and the audience dispersed to the lobby for drinks and conversation. This was the critical, operational moment, the planned interaction that was the primary purpose of the entire concert. The Pakistani diplomats left their box and descended to the main floor. Within minutes, they were approached by the Austrian businessman who'd provided their tickets. He greeted them warmly, asked about their enjoyment of the performance, and then executed the introduction that had been planned for weeks. He brought over Daniel, the Mossad officer operating under Swiss cultural attaché cover, introducing him as someone interested in expanding cultural programming between Europe and South Asia. The conversation during intermission appeared completely natural. Daniel spoke about Switzerland's interest in promoting classical music in Asia. He asked whether Pakistan had strong classical music programming, whether there would be interest in hosting European orchestras. The Pakistani diplomats were professionally courteous. They acknowledged that cultural exchanges were always positive for international relations. They discussed the general challenges of bringing Western classical music to audiences less familiar with the tradition. Daniel mentioned his upcoming travel to Islamabad, suggested they might continue the conversation, and exchanged business cards. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 12 minutes, long enough to establish personal connection and create pretext for future contact, but not so long that it would seem forced or overly interested. What made this interaction valuable from an intelligence perspective wasn't just the face-to-face introduction, though that was important for establishing Daniel's cover identity as legitimate through personal acquaintance. The real value was the physical evidence created. A photographer who appeared to be documenting the evening's cultural event for promotional purposes captured several images of Daniel conversing with the Pakistani diplomats. These photographs would later be used to reinforce Daniel's cover if Pakistani intelligence investigated him. Look, here he is at a concert reception in Vienna, speaking with various diplomatic personnel, exactly what a Swiss cultural attaché would do. The photographs created a documented history that made the cover identity more believable. Additionally, the business cards the Pakistani diplomats gave Daniel weren't just information sources. They were physical objects that could be forensically analyzed. After the intermission ended and Daniel had left the opera house, the business cards were immediately transferred to a technical team who lifted fingerprints from them using specialized equipment. These fingerprints were entered into intelligence databases where they could be matched against other collected fingerprints from documents, surfaces, or objects that Pakistani officials had touched in other contexts. Over time, this kind of biometric collection helps build comprehensive files on individuals, tracking their movements and activities even when they're using different identities or operating covertly. The second half of the concert proceeded smoothly. Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, one of Mozart's most famous works, followed by an encore of a contemporary Israeli composition that the audience appreciated as cultural representation. The Pakistani diplomats watched attentively, appeared to enjoy the performance, and left after the final applause without any indication that they suspected the evening had been anything other than a pleasant cultural experience. The civilian musicians in the orchestra were satisfied with their performance, proud that they'd represented Israeli music well in this prestigious venue. They headed back to their hotel, discussing the concert, the acoustics, the audience response, planning to explore more of Vienna the next day before their departure. The operatives and management staff had a different post-concert routine. They conducted a debriefing in a secure location, reviewing what had been accomplished. The camera footage from Box 12 had captured clear facial images of all 4 Pakistani diplomats. The intermission interaction between Daniel and the diplomats had been executed without apparent suspicion. The business cards had been collected and were being processed. No security issues or exposures had occurred. The operation was assessed as successful, achieving its intelligence objectives while maintaining the orchestra's cover as a legitimate cultural program. But the debriefing also identified areas for improvement. One of the fake violinists had been noticeably struggling during a difficult Brahms passage, and while it hadn't compromised the operation, it had been obvious enough that if any professional musicians in the audience were paying close attention, they might wonder about that player's qualifications. The solution would be better positioning in future concerts and more careful selection of repertoire that didn't expose the operative's musical limitations. Additionally, the technical crew noted that installing the concealed camera had been more difficult than expected because the lighting rig design didn't provide ideal mounting points. Future operations would require advanced scouting of venues to identify optimal surveillance equipment placement. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra left Vienna on December 16th, returning to Israel for scheduled holiday performances and a brief break before beginning a more extensive European tour in January. The civilian musicians had positive memories of Vienna, the beauty of the city, the prestige of the venue, the satisfaction of a successful performance. They talked about how this exposure would help the orchestra build its reputation internationally. They were right about that, though not in the way they understood. The Vienna concert had indeed established the orchestra's credibility, but its primary purpose had been intelligence collection, and in that regard, it had been highly successful. Mossad now had confirmed identification of Pakistani diplomatic personnel in Vienna, had established a cover identity for one of their officers that would enable future operations, and had demonstrated that the orchestra concept was operationally viable. The success of the Vienna operation provided justification for expanding the orchestra's use as intelligence infrastructure. If one concert could produce this much valuable access and information, what could a sustained touring program accomplish? Over the next 18 months, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra would perform in a dozen European cities, and each performance would serve as cover for intelligence operations targeting Pakistan's nuclear procurement network, gradually building a comprehensive picture of how the network functioned, who the key players were, and where the vulnerabilities existed that Israel might exploit to disrupt the program. Between January 1988 and June 1989, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra conducted what appeared to be an ambitious international touring program designed to establish the ensemble's reputation across Europe and expand cultural diplomacy representing Israel in countries where formal diplomatic relations were limited or complicated. The official tour schedule included performances in Brussels, Amsterdam, London, Paris, Geneva, Frankfurt, Copenhagen, and Istanbul. Each city was selected based on legitimate cultural programming considerations, the presence of venues appropriate for chamber orchestra performances, local audiences interested in classical music, and opportunities for media coverage that would build the orchestra's profile. These were the reasons provided to the civilian musicians and to the venues booking the concerts. The actual selection criteria were intelligence requirements, specifically which cities had significant Pakistani diplomatic or commercial presence related to the nuclear procurement network. Brussels was scheduled for February 1988 because the city housed not only Pakistani diplomatic missions, but also numerous European companies that Israeli intelligence suspected of supplying components for Pakistan's nuclear program. Brussels was a logical concert location because it's a major European capital with active cultural programming and audiences interested in international orchestras. The orchestra performed at the Palais des Beaux-Arts, a respected venue that legitimized their artistic credentials. But while the civilian musicians focused on performing Beethoven and Schubert, the embedded operatives were conducting surveillance on specific individuals who attended the concert, individuals whose businesses were under investigation for possible involvement in nuclear equipment sales. One of these targets was a Belgian industrialist whose manufacturing company produced high-precision machine tools, equipment that had legitimate civilian applications but could also be used for uranium enrichment centrifuge construction. Israeli intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting this company had received inquiries from Pakistani front companies about equipment specifications that matched nuclear program requirements. The industrialist was invited to attend the orchestra's Brussels concert through connections that appeared completely innocent, a mutual acquaintance interested in supporting cultural programs who thought the industrialist might enjoy an evening of classical music. He accepted the invitation, attended the concert, and during intermission was introduced to one of the orchestra's management staff, actually a Mossad officer, who engaged him in conversation about his business, his international clients, and his interest in Asian markets. This conversation was casual enough that the industrialist didn't perceive it as intelligence collection. He was being friendly at a social event, making small talk with someone connected to the cultural program he was attending. But the Mossad officer was skillfully eliciting information, asking questions that seemed natural in context, but were actually designed to assess the industrialist's knowledge of and involvement with Pakistani procurement. Does your company do much business in Asia? Which countries? What types of products are most in demand? The industrialist's answers, combined with his demeanor and the specific details he volunteered, provided intelligence analysts with information about whether he was knowingly involved in supplying Pakistan's nuclear program or was an unwitting participant whose company was being used without his full awareness. Amsterdam in March 1988 served a different intelligence purpose. The city was a major hub for international banking and diamond trading. both industries that Pakistani agents used for moving money and conducting transactions related to nuclear procurement. The orchestra performed at the Concertgebouw, one of Europe's most prestigious concert halls, a booking that significantly enhanced their artistic credibility. Among the audience members were several individuals connected to Amsterdam's Diamond District, an insular community where business relationships were often conducted through personal networks and informal agreements, rather than official contracts that left paper trails. Israeli intelligence wanted to understand how Pakistani agents were using Amsterdam's diamond trade for financial transactions, and having the orchestra perform there provided cover for operatives to make contact with people in that community. The diamond connection was particularly relevant because Israel has its own major diamond industry centered in Tel Aviv, and Israeli diamond merchants have extensive international networks, including connections to Amsterdam. One of the orchestra's sponsors, listed officially as a patron supporting cultural programming, was actually a Tel Aviv diamond merchant who served as a Mossad asset. This merchant attended the Amsterdam concert and used the event as an opportunity to meet with Amsterdam diamond traders in a social context that didn't arouse suspicion. These meetings, which appeared to be industry colleagues socializing at a cultural event, actually involved the Mossad asset asking carefully crafted questions about unusual financial transactions, large cash movements, or inquiries from Pakistani clients. The information gathered through these conversations helped Israeli intelligence map how money was flowing through Amsterdam's diamond trade into Pakistan's nuclear program. London in April 1988 was strategically important because Britain had been a major supplier of technology and equipment to Pakistan in earlier decades, and British companies remained targets for Pakistani procurement efforts. The orchestra performed at Wigmore Hall, a venue known for chamber music, where they received generally positive reviews from London critics who noted the ensemble's cohesion and the quality of their string section. The concert attracted an audience that included British Pakistani businessmen, some of whom were under surveillance by British intelligence agencies that shared information with Israeli counterparts. The concert provided an opportunity for Israeli operatives to observe these individuals in person, noting who they associated with, how they behaved in social settings, and collecting biometric data through concealed photography. One operational innovation developed during the London concert involved using the orchestra's reception, a post-performance gathering where audience members could meet the musicians, as a collection opportunity. The operatives embedded in the orchestra mingled with guests, engaging in conversations that seemed like normal social interaction between musicians and audience members. One guest, a British consultant who specialized in nuclear power plant design and who had Pakistani clients, spent considerable time speaking with one of the fake cellists about the challenges of touring internationally. During this conversation, the operative skillfully directed the discussion toward the consultant's work, asking questions about his international projects in ways that seemed like genuine interest rather than intelligence collection. The consultant, flattered by the attention and unsuspecting in this social context, provided information about his Pakistani clients that helped Israeli analysts understand which Pakistani facilities were receiving British technical support. Paris in May 1988 was chosen because France had complex relationships with both Israel and Pakistan, maintaining diplomatic and commercial ties with both countries while trying to balance competing interests. French companies were known to be supplying equipment to Pakistan, sometimes with government approval for ostensibly civilian nuclear energy purposes, other times through less official channels where commercial interests superseded non-proliferation concerns. The orchestra performed at Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, a historic venue that added prestige to their touring credentials. The audience included French government officials, defense industry representatives, and Pakistani diplomatic personnel, creating an environment where multiple intelligence targets were present simultaneously. The Paris operation was more complex than previous concerts because it involved coordination with French intelligence services, who had been informed through back channels that the Israeli orchestra had intelligence purposes beyond cultural performance. The French, while not officially endorsing the operation, had decided not to interfere as long as it didn't compromise French interests or cause diplomatic complications. This tacit acceptance allowed the Israeli operatives more operational freedom in Paris than they'd had in some other cities, though they still maintained careful security protocols because French cooperation was limited and could be withdrawn if problems emerged. Geneva in September 1988 was critical because Switzerland was a major center for the shell companies and financial arrangements that facilitated Pakistan's procurement network. Swiss banking secrecy laws made the country attractive for hiding money flows, and Swiss corporate privacy protections made it ideal for establishing front companies whose true ownership remained obscured. The orchestra performed at Victoria Hall, and among the audience were several Swiss businessmen whose companies were suspected of being fronts for Pakistani procurement. Israeli intelligence wanted to identify these individuals, confirm their connections to Pakistan, and understand how they operated within Switzerland's legal and financial systems. One of the embedded operatives during the Geneva concert's intermission had a carefully scripted encounter with a Swiss banker who managed accounts for several companies under investigation. The encounter appeared accidental, two people reaching for the same wine glass at the reception table, laughing about the coincidence, striking up conversation. The operative, using her cover identity as a violinist, asked the banker about living in Geneva, about Swiss cultural life, about whether he attended concerts regularly. The banker, charmed and unsuspicious, talked about his work in private banking, mentioned that he had clients from various countries, including some from South Asia, and provided details that seemed insignificant to him, but were valuable intelligence about how Pakistani funds were being managed through Swiss financial institutions. Frankfurt in October 1988 focused on German companies that manufactured specialized equipment for industrial applications that could be diverted to nuclear use. Germany had strict export controls following its own experience with illicit nuclear proliferation networks, but Pakistani agents had developed sophisticated methods for circumventing these controls through false end-user certificates and transshipment schemes. The orchestra performed at the Alte Oper Frankfurt, a beautifully restored concert hall, and the concert attracted German industrialists and trade officials whose professional activities intersected with the types of equipment Pakistan was seeking. The Frankfurt operation employed a technique called natural cover recruitment approach, where an intelligence officer makes contact with a potential source in a context so normal and non-threatening that the source doesn't recognize it as a recruitment attempt. One of the orchestra's management staff, a Mossad officer, approached a German trade official who attended the concert, ostensibly to discuss possibilities for the orchestra performing in other German cities. During this conversation about cultural programming, the discussion naturally shifted to international trade, cultural diplomacy, and the challenges of doing business in different regions. The Mossad officer mentioned interest in understanding how European companies navigate export regulations when dealing with developing countries, framing it as relevant to cultural organizations trying to bring equipment for performances into countries with complex customs procedures. The German official, believing he was having a professional conversation about trade policy, provided insights into how export control regulations were implemented, where the weaknesses existed, and how Pakistani buyers were exploiting those weaknesses. Copenhagen in December 1988 was selected because Danish shipping companies were being used to transport equipment from European suppliers to Pakistani destinations, often with false documentation that disguised the cargo's true nature and purpose. The orchestra performed at the Copenhagen Opera House, a booking that came with significant media attention because Danish cultural organizations were interested in promoting international artistic exchanges. The concert received positive reviews in Danish newspapers, which pleased the civilian musicians who felt their artistic work was being recognized. Meanwhile, the operatives used their presence in Copenhagen to meet with a Danish shipping industry source who'd been recruited months earlier and who provided documentation about cargo movements from European ports to Pakistan. Istanbul in January 1989 was the most operationally significant concert location because Turkey served as a crucial transit point where equipment from European suppliers was consolidated, temporarily stored, and then forwarded to Pakistan through routes that avoided scrutiny from Western customs authorities. Turkey's geographic position between Europe and Asia made it a natural logistics hub, and Turkish companies, some with knowledge of what they were handling and others acting as unwitting intermediaries, facilitated the movement of nuclear-related equipment. The orchestra's Istanbul performance at the Cemal Reşit Rey Concert Hall was carefully planned to coincide with a period when Israeli intelligence knew a major equipment shipment was being processed through Istanbul's commercial port facilities. During the Istanbul visit, while most of the orchestra was rehearsing or exploring the city as tourists, 3 of the embedded operatives and 2 management staff conducted an intelligence operation entirely separate from the concert itself. They used their presence in Istanbul, legitimized by the cultural program, to meet with a Turkish logistics company employee who'd been recruited as a source and who provided documents showing equipment shipments that matched components needed for centrifuge construction. This operation was risky because Turkish intelligence services were sophisticated and because being caught conducting espionage in Turkey would create serious diplomatic problems. But the concert provided such effective cover that the operatives could move around Istanbul, meet with sources, and collect intelligence while appearing to be musicians on a cultural tour. The psychological toll on the operatives embedded in the orchestra was accumulating over these months of continuous touring. Living a double life, maintaining cover identities constantly, performing intelligence work while surrounded by civilian colleagues who couldn't know the truth, all of this created stress that affected the operatives in various ways. Some dealt with it through compartmentalization, mentally separating their musician role from their intelligence role, switching between personas as circumstances required. Others struggled with the deception involved in building friendships with civilian musicians based on false identities. One operative later described feeling guilty about the relationships she'd developed with real musicians who trusted her and shared personal confidences, never knowing that the person they thought they knew didn't actually exist. The civilian musicians, meanwhile, were experiencing the tour as a remarkable professional opportunity. They were performing in prestigious venues, receiving positive reviews, building their resumes with impressive concert credentials. They were proud of representing Israeli culture internationally. They formed strong bonds with each other through the shared experience of touring together. For them, the orchestra was exactly what it appeared to be, a cultural program that was succeeding in its mission. The contrast between their perception and the reality of what was actually happening, an intelligence operation hidden inside a cultural program, created cognitive dissonance for the operatives who lived in both worlds simultaneously. By June 1989, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra had performed in 8 European cities, conducted dozens of intelligence operations under cultural cover, collected extensive information about Pakistan's nuclear procurement network, and established itself as a legitimate artistic organization with growing reputation in European classical music circles. The operation was succeeding beyond initial expectations. The orchestra infrastructure was proving to be remarkably effective for intelligence purposes while maintaining sufficient artistic credibility that no one outside Mossad's operational circle suspected its true purpose. But the success was also creating pressure to push the operation further, to take risks that would provide even more valuable intelligence, but would also increase the probability of exposure. And that pressure would lead to the decision that would nearly destroy everything they'd built, the decision to bring the orchestra into Pakistan itself. The Zurich concert in July 1989 was supposed to be routine, another stop on the orchestra's now well-established European touring circuit. Zurich was a logical concert location because Switzerland's cultural calendar included numerous international performances. Audiences were sophisticated and appreciative of classical music, and the city's position as a financial center made it relevant to Israeli intelligence interests regarding Pakistani nuclear financing. The concert was booked at Tonhalle Zurich, a prestigious venue with excellent acoustics and a reputation for hosting high-quality musical programming. The orchestra would perform Mendelssohn, Vivaldi, and a contemporary Israeli composition, repertoire that showcased their range while avoiding the technically demanding music that exposed the embedded operatives' musical limitations. The civilian musicians were looking forward to Zurich. The city was beautiful, the venue was prestigious, and they'd have 2 days before the concert to explore, something they appreciated about touring. They arrived on July 10th, checked into their hotel, and spent the afternoon walking around the city, visiting Lake Zurich, enjoying Swiss chocolate, behaving exactly like musicians on a cultural tour would behave. The embedded operatives maintained their covers, participating in the group activities, while internally preparing for the intelligence work they'd conduct during the concert and the 2 days surrounding it. The operational objectives for Zurich were relatively modest compared to some previous concerts, primarily photographing certain Swiss bankers who'd be attending and conducting a brief meeting with a recruited source who had information about financial transactions supporting Pakistan's program. The rehearsal at Tonhalle Zurich on July 11th proceeded normally. The orchestra ran through their program, adjusting to the hall's acoustics, which were more resonant than some venues they'd performed in recently. David, the conductor, made minor adjustments to balance and tempo, standard rehearsal work that improved the performance quality. The civilian musicians appreciated his attention to detail, his commitment to making every performance as good as possible. They didn't notice that during breaks, certain orchestra members were conducting surveillance of the hall, identifying camera positions, noting sight lines, observing security procedures. This parallel activity had become so routine for the operatives that they could do it almost unconsciously while maintaining their musician covers. Among the audience members at the Zurich concert was a Swiss intelligence officer named, I'll call him Müller, though that's not his real name, and it's a common enough Swiss surname that it doesn't identify anyone specifically. Müller worked for Switzerland's Federal Intelligence Service in a section that monitored foreign intelligence activities on Swiss territory. Switzerland's policy of neutrality didn't mean they were naive about espionage. They understood that their country's banking secrecy, geographic position, and political neutrality made it attractive for intelligence operations, and Swiss intelligence services worked to identify and monitor, though not always disrupt, foreign spy activities. Müller had counterintelligence responsibilities, identifying when foreign intelligence services were operating in Switzerland, assessing whether their activities threatened Swiss interests, and recommending responses ranging from surveillance to diplomatic protests to arrest and prosecution. Müller attended the Israeli Chamber Orchestra concert not because he suspected anything about the orchestra specifically, but because he had a personal interest in classical music. He played violin himself as a serious amateur, had studied music in his youth before choosing a career in intelligence, and regularly attended concerts in Zurich as part of his cultural life. He appreciated good musical performances and enjoyed evaluating how orchestras interpreted familiar works. He knew the Mendelssohn and Vivaldi pieces the orchestra was performing, had heard them performed many times by various ensembles, and looked forward to hearing how this Israeli group would approach the music. During the concert, Müller sat in the orchestra section with a clear view of the stage. He followed along with the performance, noting the conductor's interpretive choices, appreciating the string section's tone quality, observing the ensemble's cohesion. And then, during a particularly complex passage in the Mendelssohn where the violin section had rapid 16th note runs that required precise coordination, Müller noticed something odd. One of the violinists in the back row, a woman in her late 20s, was moving her bow in what appeared to be the correct pattern for the passage. But the movements didn't quite match the rhythmic precision that the music required. More significantly, during a brief moment, when the orchestra dynamics dropped and individual instruments were more audible, he didn't hear that particular violinist's contribution to the sound. Her bow was moving, her fingers were positioned on the strings, but no sound was coming from her instrument, or at least not enough sound to be heard even from his relatively close seat in the audience. Muller's first thought was that the violinist might be injured or having some physical problem that prevented her from playing properly. Musicians sometimes developed hand or arm issues that affected their playing. Perhaps she was nursing an injury but felt obligated to perform anyway, faking her way through the concert while her colleagues covered her part. This would be unprofessional, but not unheard of in orchestra situations where replacing a musician mid-tour was difficult. But something about the situation bothered him. The violinist's body language didn't suggest injury. She wasn't favoring one hand or showing signs of pain. She looked focused and comfortable, just like the other musicians around her. She was faking, but faking competently, as though this was intentional rather than compensating for a problem. After the concert, Muller approached one of the orchestra's management staff during the reception. He introduced himself using his cover identity, describing himself as a Swiss cultural affairs officer, which was technically true, though it omitted his intelligence service employment. He complimented the performance, said he'd particularly enjoyed their interpretation of the Mendelssohn, and then casually mentioned that he'd noticed one of the violinists seemed to be having difficulty with some passages. He asked whether the orchestra was dealing with any injury situations that might affect future performances. His tone was friendly and concerned, exactly what you'd expect from a music enthusiast who'd noticed something unusual and was asking out of genuine interest rather than suspicion. The management staff member, a Mossad officer whose cover was orchestra administration, responded smoothly without hesitation. He said yes, actually, one of their violinists had developed tendinitis during the tour and was being advised by doctors to minimize playing to allow the inflammation to heal. The violinist was continuing with the tour because finding a replacement mid-schedule was difficult, but for the more demanding passages, she was being instructed to lighten her playing, or rest entirely while the section around her covered. This was being done to prevent the injury from worsening while still maintaining the orchestra's full visual and ensemble presence. The explanation was plausible because musicians do develop repetitive stress injuries, and managing those injuries while continuing to perform is a common challenge in orchestra situations. Muller accepted this explanation, at least initially. It made sense, aligned with his understanding of how orchestras dealt with injured musicians, and the management staff member had delivered it with the casual confidence of someone discussing a routine professional issue rather than constructing a cover story under pressure. They chatted briefly about the challenges of touring, the logistics of keeping an ensemble healthy across multiple performances, and the beauty of Swiss concert halls. Then, Muller thanked him for the conversation, complimented the orchestra's work again, and left the reception. The Mossad officer immediately recognized the interaction as potentially problematic and reported it during the post-concert operational debriefing that happened later that night in a secure location away from the hotel where the civilian musicians stayed. The debriefing discussion focused on whether Muller's question represented genuine music enthusiast curiosity or intelligence service suspicion. The fact that he'd identified himself as a cultural affairs officer was concerning because that could be cover for intelligence work, exactly the way orchestra management positions served as cover for Mossad officers. The specificity of his observation, noting not just that a musician was playing poorly but that she appeared to be deliberately not playing, suggested someone with musical knowledge who was paying close attention. The possibility that Swiss intelligence had become suspicious of the orchestra's activities was serious enough that Mossad's operational controllers in Tel Aviv were contacted for guidance on whether to abort future Swiss concerts or continue with heightened caution. Over the next 2 days, while the orchestra remained in Zurich before departing for their next tour stop, Mossad ran a background check on the person who'd identified himself as Müller. They discovered he was indeed employed by Switzerland's Cultural Ministry, but cross-referencing with intelligence holdings revealed he also had connections to Swiss intelligence services. This confirmed that the interaction had been more than casual conversation from a music enthusiast. Müller was a counterintelligence officer who'd noticed something suspicious and was following up, albeit diplomatically through a seemingly innocent inquiry rather than through official channels that would have created immediate diplomatic complications. Mossad now faced a decision about how to respond. They could pull the orchestra out of Switzerland entirely, canceling future Swiss concerts and avoiding further exposure risk. But this would seem suspicious and might actually increase Swiss intelligence curiosity about why an orchestra would suddenly cancel performances over what appeared to be a minor injury issue. They could continue operating in Switzerland, but withdraw the specific violinist whose lack of playing had been noticed, claiming her injury required return to Israel for treatment. But this might not fully resolve Swiss concerns if they'd already begun investigating the orchestra more broadly. Or they could reinforce the cover story, bring in an actual musician to temporarily replace the injured violinist, and demonstrate that the orchestra's explanation had been legitimate all along. They chose the third option, the most elaborate but also the most convincing. Within 48 hours, a genuine Israeli violinist, who was not a Mossad operative, a professional musician with legitimate credentials and verifiable background, was flown from Tel Aviv to join the orchestra for the remainder of the tour. The original operative, who'd been identified, was officially sent home due to her worsening injury, which was explained to the civilian orchestra members as necessary medical treatment that couldn't wait until the tour ended. This personnel change was documented, communicated to the venues where upcoming concerts were booked, and made visible enough that if Swiss intelligence was monitoring the orchestra, they'd see that the management's explanation about an injured musician had been accurate, and that the orchestra had responded appropriately by bringing in a healthy replacement. The replacement violinist, the real musician, who had no knowledge of the orchestra's intelligence purposes, was told she was being hired temporarily to cover for an injured colleague, a common situation in professional music where substitutes fill in when regular members can't perform. She arrived, rehearsed with the orchestra to integrate into their ensemble sound, and performed in the subsequent concerts without any idea that her hiring was actually an operational security measure designed to convince Swiss intelligence that their suspicions were unfounded. Her presence validated the cover story in the most convincing way possible by being completely genuine rather than an elaborate fabrication. Müller, monitoring the situation through his cultural ministry contacts and through informal observation, saw that the Israeli orchestra had indeed replaced an injured musician exactly as their management had explained. He attended the orchestra's next Swiss concert in Basel 3 weeks later and observed that the violin section now included a different musician in the position where the previous violinist had sat, and this new violinist was clearly playing properly without any of the irregularities he'd noticed in Zurich. His initial suspicion was reduced, though not eliminated entirely, because the orchestra's response was consistent with the injury explanation they'd provided. If this had been a cover-up of intelligence activity, he reasoned, they would have been more likely to disappear quietly rather than address the issue openly by bringing in a replacement. For Mossad, the Zurich incident was a wake-up call about the vulnerabilities of the orchestra operation. A single observant person with musical knowledge had nearly exposed the entire infrastructure by noticing that one operative wasn't actually playing her instrument. If that observation had been pursued more aggressively, if Swiss intelligence had decided to investigate the orchestra thoroughly, if Müller had been more suspicious or less diplomatic in his approach, the operation could have been compromised entirely. All the resources invested in creating and maintaining the orchestra, all the intelligence collected through previous concerts, all the future potential of the cover infrastructure, all of it could have been lost because one fake violinist couldn't quite fake her playing convincingly enough. The incident led to immediate operational changes. First, the embedded operatives received additional musical training to improve their ability to fake playing without being detected. Second, the orchestra's repertoire selection became even more conservative, avoiding pieces that would expose the operatives' limitations. Third, operatives were repositioned within sections to minimize visibility, placed in positions where their lack of genuine playing would be less noticeable. Fourth, the ratio of real musicians to fake musicians in each section was adjusted, adding more legitimate players to provide better cover for the operatives embedded among them. And fifth, Mossad acknowledged that the orchestra's operational lifespan was limited, that accumulating exposure risks meant they couldn't use this infrastructure indefinitely without eventual compromise. The civilian musicians in the orchestra never knew how close they'd come to being part of an exposed intelligence operation. They knew that one of their colleagues had to leave the tour for medical reasons and was replaced by a substitute violinist. This seemed like a normal, if unfortunate, situation that orchestras deal with regularly. They welcomed the new violinist, helped her integrate into the ensemble, and continued performing with the focus on musical quality that had characterized their work throughout the tour. For them, the Zurich concert was just another performance, memorable perhaps for the beautiful venue and the Swiss audience's appreciation, but not for the counterintelligence crisis that had happened invisibly around them. The Zurich incident demonstrated something fundamental about intelligence operations using deep cover infrastructure like the orchestra. No matter how carefully planned, no matter how thoroughly executed, there's always vulnerability to simple human observation. An experienced musician happened to be watching carefully at exactly the moment when an operative's limitations were most exposed. That single moment of bad luck nearly unraveled everything. The operation survived because Mossad responded quickly and effectively, reinforcing the cover story in ways that reduced Swiss suspicions. But the incident was a reminder that operational security in this kind of program was fragile, dependent on maintaining an elaborate deception constantly and perfectly, because one mistake, one observant person, one moment of exposure could compromise everything. By October 1989, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra had performed across Europe for nearly 2 years, conducting intelligence operations under cultural cover in a dozen cities, collecting extensive information about Pakistan's nuclear procurement network operating in European commercial and financial centers. The intelligence gathered had been valuable, identifying suppliers, tracking financial flows, mapping the network's European infrastructure. But a fundamental problem remained. Most of the intelligence was about the procurement network's logistics and support structure, the companies that supplied equipment, the financial institutions that facilitated payments, the logistics firms that handled shipping. What Israeli intelligence still lacked was deep understanding of Pakistan's actual nuclear program itself, the facilities where uranium was being enriched, the technical progress toward weaponization, the decision-making process within Pakistan's nuclear establishment, and most critically, Pakistan's intentions regarding nuclear proliferation to other countries. That information existed primarily in Pakistan, specifically in Karachi, the country's largest city and a major hub for Pakistan's nuclear program logistics. Karachi hosted offices of the organizations managing procurement, facilities where imported equipment was received and processed before being forwarded to nuclear sites elsewhere in Pakistan, and meeting spaces where Pakistani officials coordinated with foreign suppliers and technical advisors. Getting intelligence from inside Pakistan had always been Mossad's ultimate objective, but it was also exponentially more dangerous than operating in Europe. Pakistan had sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities, maintained active surveillance of foreign nationals, and would treat any Israeli intelligence officers discovered on Pakistani territory as spies subject to arrest, prosecution, and likely execution. The debate within Mossad about whether to attempt bringing the orchestra operation into Pakistan had been ongoing since early 1989. Conservative voices argued that the risk was unacceptable, that exposure in Pakistan would mean not just loss of the orchestra infrastructure, but potential death or long-term imprisonment of operatives, and that diplomatic fallout would damage Israel's relationships with countries that maintained relations with Pakistan. Aggressive voices countered that the intelligence potential justified the risk, that the orchestra cover had proven remarkably effective across Europe and might work equally well in Pakistan, and that without access to Pakistan itself, Israeli understanding of the nuclear program would remain incomplete and possibly misleading. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction through a Pakistani cultural organization that was genuinely interested in promoting international artistic exchanges as part of Pakistan's efforts to present itself as a modern, culturally sophisticated nation rather than merely a security threat obsessed with nuclear weapons. The Karachi Arts Council, a semi-governmental organization that organized cultural programming in Pakistan's largest city, had been working to bring international performers to Pakistan throughout the 1980s. They'd hosted orchestras from the Soviet Union, from China, from various European countries. Bringing an Israeli orchestra would be politically complicated given Pakistan's official non-recognition of Israel, but it wasn't impossible if handled correctly through intermediaries that provided plausible deniability. The approach to the Karachi Arts Council was made through a European cultural foundation that specialized in promoting East-West cultural exchanges. This foundation, which had legitimate programming history and credible reputation, was also a Mossad front organization, one of several that Israeli intelligence had created precisely for these kinds of operations. The foundation approached the Karachi Arts Council with a proposal. They represented a chamber orchestra that was touring internationally and was interested in performing in South Asia as part of their mission to build cultural bridges. The orchestra's identity would be managed carefully to avoid immediate political complications. They wouldn't be presented as specifically Israeli, though their repertoire would include some Israeli compositions alongside standard European classical works. The emphasis would be on international cultural exchange rather than national representation. The Karachi Arts Council was intrigued but cautious. They consulted with Pakistan's Ministry of Culture and with intelligence services to assess whether hosting this orchestra created security or political risks. The European Cultural Foundation's credentials checked out as legitimate. The orchestra had performance history showing successful concerts across Europe. The proposed repertoire was professionally appropriate and culturally unobjectionable. The Pakistani officials who reviewed the proposal saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate Pakistan's cultural openness and sophistication, showing that they could host international arts programming despite regional tensions and security concerns. After several months of negotiations, permissions, and logistics planning, a concert was scheduled for March 19, 1989, at the Karachi Arts Council's performance venue. For Mossad, getting approval for the concert was just the beginning of an extraordinarily complex operational challenge. They had to get Israeli operatives into Pakistan using identities that wouldn't immediately identify them as Israeli, since Pakistani immigration would deny entry to anyone with Israeli passports or obvious Israeli connections. They had to prepare the operatives for operating in a hostile environment where they'd have no official support, no safe houses, no extraction options if things went wrong. They had to identify intelligence targets in Karachi and plan specific operations that could be accomplished during the brief window when the orchestra would be in the city, and they had to maintain the orchestra's cover as a legitimate cultural program while conducting high-risk intelligence work in the most dangerous operational environment the program had faced. The solution to the passport problem was creating false identity documentation for the entire orchestra. The civilian musicians who still didn't know the orchestra had intelligence purposes were told that because of diplomatic complications related to Pakistan not recognizing Israel, the tour organizers would provide alternative travel documents that presented the orchestra as a European cultural ensemble rather than specifically Israeli. This was explained as a practical necessity to avoid political complications that might cancel the concert. The musicians were given passports from various European countries, particularly smaller nations where passport fraud was harder to detect, all carefully forged by Mossad's technical services. These weren't just superficial fakes, they were sophisticated documents with genuine security features, created using stolen passport blanks or produced with such technical accuracy that they could pass inspection by immigration authorities. The embedded operatives received even more elaborate false documentation, complete identity legends that positioned them as citizens of various European countries with verifiable backgrounds that would withstand investigation if Pakistani intelligence decided to check. One operative became Swedish, with documentation showing birth in Stockholm, music education at a Swedish conservatory, and performance history with Swedish ensembles. Another became Austrian, with Vienna residency and connections to Austria's classical music establishment. Each legend was constructed with enough detail that if questioned, the operative could provide consistent answers about their background, their training, their career history. But the legends also had to be simple enough that the operatives could maintain them under stress, because complex false identities become harder to sustain when facing aggressive questioning or unexpected challenges. The operational planning for Karachi identified three primary intelligence objectives. First, photographic and video surveillance of Pakistani nuclear program personnel who were expected to attend the concert or would be accessible in Karachi during the orchestra's visit. Second, meeting with a recruited source, a Pakistani scientist who'd been providing information to Israeli intelligence and who needed a secure way to transfer documents that couldn't be transmitted electronically. Third, installing listening devices in the Karachi Arts Council building itself, where post-concert receptions would be held and where Pakistani officials and foreign suppliers sometimes conducted informal meetings. These objectives were ambitious, given the constraints of operating in Pakistan for just 72 hours, but the opportunity to place Israeli intelligence operatives in Karachi might not come again. The preparation included extensive briefings on Pakistani culture, security procedures, and operational security protocols for hostile environments. The operatives were trained on what to do if detained by Pakistani authorities, what information they could reveal, and what they absolutely had to protect, even under interrogation. They were given code words for emergency communications and contingency plans for attempting to reach Israeli diplomatic contacts through third countries if everything went wrong. They were reminded repeatedly that if they were exposed as Israeli intelligence officers in Pakistan, they would likely face execution, and that Israel would publicly deny any connection to them to avoid diplomatic catastrophe. This wasn't meant to be discouraging, it was simply realistic about the stakes of what they were attempting. The civilian musicians in the orchestra were nervous about traveling to Pakistan for different reasons. Some had security concerns about visiting a country with significant terrorism problems and history of violence against Westerners. Others worried about cultural adjustment, traveling to a Muslim-majority country with different social norms and expectations. Some were excited about the adventure of performing in such an unusual location. Orchestra management addressed these concerns with careful messaging, emphasizing the security measures that would be in place, the support from local organizations, and the significance of cultural diplomacy through music. The civilian musicians didn't know that their security concerns, while valid, were actually less severe than the risks the embedded operatives were facing from potential exposure as spies. The flight to Karachi departed from Geneva on March 17, 1989. The orchestra traveled as a group, their instruments in cargo hold, their falsified passports ready for Pakistani immigration. The civilian musicians experienced normal travel anxiety, wondering what Pakistan would be like, how the audience would respond, whether the performance venue would be adequate. The operatives maintained their covers while internally running through operational protocols, reviewing target identifications, confirming communication procedures. The flight took approximately 7 hours, crossing from Europe through Middle Eastern airspace into Pakistan, each mile bringing them closer to either spectacular intelligence success or catastrophic operational failure. Landing in Karachi meant passing through Pakistani immigration, the first major test of their false documentation. Pakistani immigration officers were trained to watch for irregular travelers, forged documents, and suspicious patterns. The orchestra members were processed individually, their passports examined, their stated purpose for visiting Pakistan questioned. The immigration officers saw a European orchestra arriving for a cultural performance, documentation from the Karachi Arts Council confirming their invitation, passports from various European countries that appeared legitimate. The civilian musicians answered questions honestly about their purpose. They were musicians performing a concert. The operatives answered with their rehearsed cover stories, maintaining calm demeanor, despite understanding that exposure at this point would mean immediate arrest. After approximately 40 minutes, the entire orchestra cleared immigration without incident and proceeded to collect their luggage and instruments. Outside the airport, buses arranged by the Karachi Arts Council waited to transport the orchestra to their hotel. As the musicians loaded equipment and settled into seats for the ride through Karachi's chaotic traffic, the civilian musicians looked out windows at a city that was dramatically different from the European capitals they'd been touring. Karachi was crowded, intense, vibrant in ways that felt both exciting and overwhelming. The operatives saw something different: surveillance opportunities, potential threats, the operational environment where they'd be conducting intelligence work over the next 3 days. The mission had begun. They were inside Pakistan. They were in position, and everything they'd spent nearly 2 years preparing for was about to be tested in the most dangerous operational environment Mossad had deployed the orchestra into. What happened over the next 72 hours would either validate the entire operation or destroy it completely. The hotel where the Israeli Chamber Orchestra was accommodated in Karachi was a 4-star property in the Clifton neighborhood, an area near the Arabian Sea where many of the city's diplomatic missions and international organizations maintained offices. The hotel catered to foreign businessmen and cultural delegations, with staff experienced in handling international guests and security arrangements that balanced accessibility with reasonable protection. The civilian musicians checked into their rooms with the typical exhaustion and disorientation that comes from long-distance travel, appreciating the air conditioning that provided relief from Karachi's humid March heat. They unpacked, showered, and gathered for dinner in the hotel restaurant, discussing the next day's rehearsal schedule and comparing impressions of their first hours in Pakistan. The embedded operatives went through the same routines, maintaining their covers as tired musicians recovering from travel, but their attention was on operational security and intelligence collection that would begin immediately. One operative noted the hotel security cameras and their coverage patterns. Another observed Pakistani security personnel who were clearly monitoring the orchestra's presence, uniformed guards supplemented by plainclothes officers whose attention to the group suggested intelligence service surveillance rather than routine hotel security. A third operative confirmed the communications equipment concealed in her luggage had made it through customs. Without detection, small transmitters and receivers that would be used for coordination during the next 2 days. That evening, after the civilian musicians had retired to their rooms, 3 operatives and 2 members of the orchestra's management staff, Both Mossad officers held a brief meeting in a room that had been swept for listening devices using detection equipment brought into Pakistan disguised as electronic tuning equipment for musical instruments. The meeting reviewed the operational timeline for the next 72 hours. Day 1 would focus on reconnaissance and preparation, familiarizing themselves with the concert venue, identifying surveillance coverage, and confirming the locations where intelligence targets would be accessible. Day 2 would be the concert itself and the critical post-performance reception where they'd have direct access to Pakistani nuclear program personnel. Day 3 would be departure, getting out of Pakistan before any operational security failures could result in detention. The primary intelligence target was a Pakistani nuclear scientist named, I'll call him Dr. Rahman, though that's not his real name, and individual identification would compromise security even decades later. Dr. Rahman worked at one of Pakistan's uranium enrichment facilities and had been recruited as an Israeli intelligence source 2 years earlier through an approach operation in Europe. His motivation for betraying Pakistan's nuclear program was complex, involving personal grievances with program leadership, ideological opposition to nuclear proliferation, and financial compensation that Mossad provided. He'd been supplying information through various covert communication methods, but he had documents that were too sensitive to transmit electronically or photographically, technical specifications and program plans that needed to be physically transferred to Israeli handlers. Dr. Rahman had been invited to attend the orchestra's concert as a guest of the Karachi Arts Council, which regularly invited prominent Pakistani academics and professionals to cultural events as part of their outreach programming. His attendance wouldn't raise suspicion because he had legitimate interest in classical music and had attended previous international performances in Karachi. The plan was for Dr. Rahman to make contact with one of the Mossad officers during the post-concert reception, a contact that would appear like casual conversation between a Pakistani professional and a European cultural worker, during which Dr. Rahman would transfer a microfilm containing the documents he'd photographed. The transfer would happen through a brush pass, a technique where two people make brief physical contact that allows an object to be passed without obvious hand-to-hand exchange. The morning of March 18th, the orchestra traveled to the Karachi Arts Council performance venue for their scheduled rehearsal. The building was a modern structure built in the 1970s with a performance hall that seated approximately 800 people, adequate acoustics for chamber orchestra performances, and technical facilities that were reasonably well maintained despite some equipment aging. The orchestra's technical crew, which included 2 Mossad operatives whose cover was audio and lighting management, began setting up equipment with the assistance of local Pakistani stagehands. This setup process provided legitimate access to the building's infrastructure, allowing the operatives to identify locations where surveillance equipment could be installed. During the rehearsal, while David the conductor worked with the orchestra on tempo and dynamics for the evening's program, one of the technical operatives installed 2 miniature listening devices in the building. The first was placed in the reception area adjacent to the performance hall, concealed inside a decorative light fixture where it would capture conversations during the post-concert gathering. The second was installed in a small conference room that the Karachi Arts Council used for meetings, a room where Pakistani officials and foreign visitors sometimes conducted business discussions. Both devices were powered by small batteries that would last approximately 1 week and transmitted on frequencies that could be received by equipment positioned in a nearby location that Mossad had arranged access to through a Pakistani asset. The technical installation was executed during moments when the operatives had brief privacy, when Pakistani staff were focused elsewhere, or when the confusion of rehearsal setup provided cover for their actions. The devices were extremely small, approximately the size of a shirt button, and were designed to be difficult to detect even with electronic sweeping equipment. They weren't perfect, no surveillance device is completely undetectable, but they were sophisticated enough that They'd likely remain undiscovered unless someone specifically suspected the building was bugged and conducted a thorough technical security inspection. The civilian musicians, focused on their rehearsal and adjusting to the hall's acoustics, had no awareness of these parallel activities. They were concerned with musical matters, tuning their instruments to accommodate Karachi's humidity, which affected how wood and strings responded, adjusting to the hall's resonance, which was more live than some recent venues they'd performed in, preparing mentally for performing in front of an audience whose cultural background meant they might respond differently than European audiences. David worked them through challenging passages, refined balance between sections, and assured them that despite the unusual circumstances of performing in Pakistan, their job remained the same, making music as beautifully and professionally as they could. That afternoon, while most of the orchestra rested at the hotel or explored Karachi in small supervised groups, accompanied by local guides, one of the Mossad officers had a brief meeting with a Pakistani asset, who provided updated intelligence about which nuclear program personnel would attend the evening's concert. The asset, who worked in an administrative capacity at one of Pakistan's nuclear facilities, had access to attendance lists for the cultural event, and had identified 6 individuals connected to Pakistan's nuclear program who'd confirmed attendance. These included Dr. Rahman, the recruited source, and 5 others who were targets for surveillance photography that would help Israeli intelligence build comprehensive files on Pakistani nuclear personnel. The concert that evening began at 7:30. The audience arrived wearing a mix of traditional Pakistani dress and Western business attire, representing Karachi's educated professional class, diplomatic community, and cultural establishment. The atmosphere was formal and respectful, with an expectation of serious artistic performance rather than casual entertainment. The Karachi Arts Council's leadership welcomed the audience, spoke about the importance of international cultural exchange, and thanked the visiting orchestra for bringing European classical music to Pakistan. The lights dimmed, the Israeli Chamber Orchestra took the stage to polite applause, and David stepped onto the podium to begin conducting. The program opened with Vivaldi's 4 Seasons, specifically the spring and summer concertos, performed with the bright, energetic interpretation that Vivaldi requires. The Pakistani audience listened attentively, responding positively to the music's vitality and the orchestra's technical execution. The civilian musicians performed with focus and pride, aware that they were representing not just themselves but international cultural cooperation in a setting where such cooperation was rare and politically significant. The embedded operatives maintained their covers as musicians, playing what they could and faking the rest, while simultaneously conducting visual surveillance of the audience, identifying target individuals based on photographs they'd memorized during operational preparation. Sarah, one of the fake violinists who'd been with the orchestra since the Vienna concert nearly 18 months earlier, had a clear view of the audience from her position in the violin section. She'd memorized the faces of 6 Pakistani nuclear personnel who were expected to attend, and during moments when her part consisted of rests or simple sustained notes that required minimal attention, she scanned the audience, identifying targets. She located Dr. Rahman sitting in the 4th row center section, accompanied by what appeared to be his wife. She identified 2 other target individuals sitting separately in different sections of the hall. The miniature camera concealed in the stage lighting system, installed by the technical crew during afternoon setup, was capturing video footage of the audience. But Sarah's visual confirmation provided real-time intelligence that would be reported during the post-concert debriefing. At intermission, the audience moved to the reception area where refreshments were served, following the cultural tradition of using concert intermissions for socializing and discussion of the performance. The Pakistani attendees mixed with the orchestra members who'd come out to meet the audience, a standard practice in chamber orchestra performances where the intimacy of the setting encourages interaction between performers and listeners. Dr. Rahman approached one of the violinists, a civilian musician, and complimented the orchestra's interpretation of Vivaldi, asking questions about the musician's training and background. The conversation was genuine. Dr. Rahman had authentic interest in classical music, and the musician appreciated speaking with an enthusiastic audience member. Meanwhile, one of the Mossad officers, the orchestra's tour manager, whose cover was logistics coordination, positioned himself near the refreshment table where he had clear view of the reception area. Dr. Rahman, after finishing his conversation with the civilian musician, moved toward the refreshments and made eye contact with the Mossad officer, a brief glance that confirmed mutual recognition. They didn't approach each other directly because that would create a traceable connection. Instead, they both moved through the crowded reception space following a pattern that appeared random but had been choreographed in advance. After approximately 3 minutes of separate movement, they ended up standing near each other in a group of people discussing the concert. The Mossad officer initiated casual conversation, introducing himself using his cover identity as representing the European Cultural Foundation sponsoring the orchestra's tour. Dr. Rahman responded politely, mentioning his appreciation for international cultural programs and his own interest in classical music. They spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, surrounded by other people, their conversation appearing exactly like the dozens of similar interactions happening throughout the reception. During this conversation, they executed the brush pass. Dr. Rahman reached past the Mossad officer to pick up a glass of juice from a nearby table, his movement bringing him within physical contact distance. As he withdrew his hand holding the glass, his other hand briefly touched the Mossad officer's hand, transferring a small object approximately the size of a coin. The transfer took less than 1 second and was invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. The object was a microfilm cartridge containing photographs of documents that Dr. Rahman had taken over the previous 3 months, technical specifications for centrifuge components, procurement lists for equipment needed for uranium enrichment, internal communications about program progress, and most significantly, documents suggesting that Pakistan was preparing to offer nuclear technology assistance to other countries as part of strategic alliances and financial arrangements. This information was exactly what Israeli intelligence needed to understand Pakistan's proliferation intentions, the question that had motivated this entire risky operation into Pakistan itself. After the transfer, Dr. Rahman continued his movement through the reception, speaking with other audience members, behaving exactly as he would during any cultural event. The Mossad officer moved in a different direction, eventually stepping outside the reception area, ostensibly to make a phone call, actually to secure the microfilm cartridge by concealing it in a hidden compartment in his briefcase. The transfer was complete, and unless Pakistani intelligence had been conducting intensive surveillance specifically on Dr. Rahman or the Mossad officer, which seemed unlikely given the crowded social setting and the absence of obvious reason to suspect either individual, the operation had been executed without detection. The second half of the concert featured Beethoven's Symphony No. 7, a piece that required more technical precision and ensemble coordination than the Vivaldi. The orchestra performed well, David conducting with energy that drew strong performance from the musicians, and the audience responded with enthusiastic applause that suggested genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. After the final bows, after the stage lights came up and the audience began filing out, the civilian musicians felt satisfaction that they'd successfully performed in one of the most unusual venues of their touring career. They'd brought classical music to Pakistan, had represented international cultural cooperation, and had received positive response from an audience whose enthusiasm validated their work. The post-concert reception continued for another hour, with orchestra members mingling with Pakistani guests, answering questions about their training and experiences, discussing the similarities and differences between European and Pakistani cultural traditions. The operatives maintained their covers while conducting final surveillance, photographing additional individuals, observing who spoke with whom, gathering intelligence that would be analyzed once they returned to Israel. One operative had a brief conversation with a Pakistani businessman who mentioned his company's international trade activities, information that seemed innocuous but actually provided insights into procurement network operations. By 10:30 that evening, the reception was concluding, and the orchestra returned to their hotel. The civilian musicians were tired but pleased, discussing the concert's success and the unexpected warmth of the Pakistani audience's response. The operatives and Mossad management staff were calculating risk, assessing whether the intelligence operations had been executed cleanly or whether any signs suggested. Pakistani security services had become suspicious. The microfilm from Dr. Rahman was secured in a diplomatic pouch that would be transported out of Pakistan through channels that didn't directly connect to the orchestra. The surveillance footage and photographs were being processed by technical staff. The listening devices installed in the Karachi Arts Council building were operational and beginning to capture conversations that would continue providing intelligence after the orchestra departed. The following morning, March 19th, the orchestra prepared for departure. They packed instruments, checked out of the hotel, and traveled to the airport for their flight back to Europe. Pakistani immigration processed their exit documentation, examining the same false European passports that had gotten them into the country. The immigration officers saw a visiting orchestra completing their cultural mission and returning home. Nothing suspicious, no reason for enhanced scrutiny. After approximately 30 minutes, the orchestra cleared immigration and boarded their flight. As the aircraft lifted off from Karachi and climbed into Pakistani airspace before turning northwest toward Europe, the tension that the operatives had been managing for 72 hours began to release slightly. They weren't completely safe until the aircraft left Pakistani airspace, because even after departure, Pakistani authorities could theoretically demand the flight return if they discovered something that warranted investigation. But with each passing minute, the probability of exposure decreased. 45 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft crossed into international airspace. The mission was complete. They'd successfully deployed Israeli intelligence operatives into Pakistan, conducted surveillance on nuclear program personnel, received documents from a recruited source, installed listening devices in a facility where Pakistani officials gathered, and extracted everyone safely without apparent exposure. The civilian musicians slept during the flight, exhausted from the intense experience of performing in Pakistan and relieved to be returning to familiar territory. The operatives remained vigilant but allowed themselves some satisfaction at having accomplished what many Mossad planners had considered too risky to attempt. The intelligence gathered during the Karachi operation would be analyzed over the following weeks, contributing to Israeli understanding of Pakistan's nuclear program and proliferation intentions in ways that no amount of European surveillance could have achieved. The operation had succeeded beyond reasonable expectations, proving that creative cover infrastructure like the touring orchestra could provide access to intelligence targets that conventional espionage methods couldn't reach. But it had also demonstrated the limits of how far such operations could be pushed, because the risks taken in Pakistan were at the absolute edge of acceptable. Operational security and pushing further would likely result in exposure and failure. The intelligence that Dr. Rahman provided through the microfilm transfer during the Karachi concert proved to be among the most significant intelligence Israel collected regarding Pakistan's nuclear program during the entire 1980s. The documents photographed on the microfilm included technical specifications that confirmed Pakistan had successfully developed uranium enrichment capabilities sufficient for weapons-grade material production. They included procurement lists that identified specific companies in Europe and Asia that were supplying critical components, information that allowed Israeli intelligence to map the complete supply network with unprecedented detail. They included internal communications that revealed Pakistan's nuclear program was ahead of what Western intelligence agencies had estimated, suggesting that Pakistan might be capable of testing a nuclear device within 2 to 3 years rather than the 5 to 7 years that previous assessments had predicted. Most significantly, the documents included correspondence between Pakistani nuclear program leadership and officials from other countries exploring potential nuclear cooperation. The correspondence was carefully worded to maintain plausible deniability, discussing peaceful nuclear energy cooperation and technical exchanges rather than explicitly mentioning weapons, but the implications were clear to intelligence analysts. Pakistan was positioning itself to provide nuclear technology assistance to countries that couldn't develop programs independently, specifically countries that had strategic relationships with Pakistan and financial resources to compensate for Pakistani assistance. The countries mentioned in the correspondence included Saudi Arabia, which had provided significant funding for Pakistan's program, and Libya, which had been seeking nuclear weapons capability for years. This intelligence about potential proliferation was exactly what Israeli strategic planners needed to understand the broader threat they faced. If Pakistan developed nuclear weapons and then proliferated the technology to Saudi Arabia or Libya, Israel would suddenly face multiple nuclear-armed adversaries rather than just one distant country with no direct territorial disputes. The intelligence allowed Israel to begin diplomatic efforts to pressure Pakistan against proliferation, working through the United States and other countries that had influence in Islamabad. It also informed Israeli contingency planning for potential military options if proliferation appeared imminent, though such options were extraordinarily difficult given Pakistan's distance from Israel and the diplomatic complications of attacking a country that wasn't directly engaged in conflict with Israel. The listening devices installed in the Karachi Arts Council building during the concert setup operated for 6 days before their batteries depleted. During those 6 days, they captured approximately 40 hours of conversations, including several meetings between Pakistani nuclear program personnel and foreign suppliers, discussing equipment deliveries and technical specifications. The conversations were in a mix of English and Urdu, requiring translation by intelligence analysts with appropriate language skills. But they provided real-time intelligence about ongoing procurement activities and upcoming shipments that allowed Israel to alert Western countries about specific transactions that violated export control regulations. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra continued touring through the remainder of 1989 and into 1990, performing concerts across Europe and establishing themselves as a respected chamber ensemble with growing reputation in classical music circles. They performed in Berlin shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a historic concert that civilian musicians would remember as one of the highlights of their careers, performing music in a city celebrating the end of Cold War division. They performed in Madrid, in Stockholm, in Prague, each concert serving dual purposes as legitimate cultural programming and as cover for intelligence operations that had become more focused and selective following the risks taken in Karachi. But by 1990, Mossad's leadership was increasingly concerned about the orchestra's accumulated exposure risk. The Zurich incident, where a Swiss intelligence officer had noticed an operative not actually playing her instrument, had been resolved successfully, but it demonstrated that the cover infrastructure was fragile and vulnerable to observation by knowledgeable individuals. The Karachi operation had succeeded, but the risks taken there were at the extreme edge of acceptable security, and attempting similar operations in other hostile environments would likely result in exposure. Additionally, the geopolitical situation was changing in ways that reduced the intelligence value of the orchestra program while increasing its security vulnerabilities. The Soviet Union was collapsing, ending the Cold War dynamic that had shaped international relations for 4 decades. Pakistan's nuclear program, while still a significant concern, was becoming more openly acknowledged, reducing the intelligence gaps that had made covert collection so critical. Western countries were implementing stronger export controls and international cooperation on non-proliferation, providing Israel with more information through intelligence-sharing partnerships rather than requiring independent collection through risky operations. And the orchestra itself had accumulated enough operational history that detailed investigation by hostile intelligence services would likely reveal patterns and connections that suggested intelligence purposes rather than purely cultural programming. In March 1991, exactly 2 years after the Karachi concert, Mossad made the decision to wind down the orchestra operation. The decision was framed publicly as budgetary constraints and shifting cultural programming priorities. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra would complete its existing concert commitments through June 1991, then would cease operations with the explanation that government funding for cultural diplomacy programs was being redirected to other priorities in the post-Cold War environment. This explanation was plausible because governments regularly adjusted cultural programming budgets based on strategic priorities. And the end of the Cold War was genuinely causing reassessment of international cultural initiatives across many countries. The civilian musicians were disappointed but not entirely surprised. They'd known the orchestra was dependent on government support, and they understood that such support wasn't guaranteed indefinitely. Some of them found positions with other orchestras in Israel or Europe. Others transitioned into teaching or other music-related careers. They had positive memories of their time with the Israeli Chamber Orchestra, the prestigious venues they'd performed in, the international exposure they'd gained, the friendships they'd developed. They believed they'd been part of a legitimate cultural initiative that had succeeded in promoting Israeli arts internationally before budget realities forced its conclusion. Very few of them ever learned that the orchestra they'd performed with had actually been an intelligence operation, that many of their colleagues had been Mossad operatives, and that the concerts they'd performed had served as cover for espionage targeting nuclear proliferation networks. The embedded operatives transitioned back to other assignments within Mossad, their musical careers ending after 3 years of living double lives as performing musicians and intelligence officers. Some of them found the transition difficult, missing the adrenaline of operational work and the unique challenge of maintaining deep cover in civilian environments. Others were relieved to stop living constantly under false identities, to stop maintaining relationships based on deception, to return to more conventional intelligence work where they didn't have to pretend to be someone else every moment of every day. One operative later described the experience as both the most professionally satisfying and the most psychologically exhausting work she'd done in her intelligence career. David, the conductor who'd led the orchestra through nearly 4 years of performances, returned to his previous career as a freelance conductor in Israel and Europe. He never publicly acknowledged the orchestra's intelligence purposes, maintaining the discretion that his recruitment as a Mossad asset required. He occasionally mentioned in interviews that the Israeli Chamber Orchestra had been one of the most interesting projects of his career, performing in unusual locations and bringing classical music to audiences that rarely encountered Israeli cultural programming. His comments were always framed as musical and cultural reflections rather than intelligence matters, maintaining operational security even decades after the program ended. The orchestra's operational security held for over 15 years after the program ended. Israeli intelligence never officially acknowledged that the Israeli Chamber Orchestra had been anything other than a cultural program. The concerts happened, the programs were performed, the reviews were published, and nothing in the public record suggested intelligence activities. But in 2007, details about the operation began leaking through unauthorized disclosures from former intelligence personnel who'd been involved in planning or executing orchestra operations. These leaks were initially dismissed as speculation or rumor because definitive proof was difficult to establish. Intelligence operations are designed to be deniable, and the orchestra had been constructed with sufficient separation between legitimate cultural activities and intelligence work that proving the connection required access to classified files that weren't publicly available. More substantial exposure came in 2012 when a former Mossad officer published a memoir that included brief mentions of cultural cover operations, including an orchestra used for intelligence purposes in the 1980s. The memoir was heavily redacted by Israeli censors who removed specific operational details, but enough information remained to confirm that the program had existed and had conducted operations across Europe and into Pakistan. Investigative journalists began examining the Israeli Chamber Orchestra's history, reviewing concert programs and venue records, identifying individuals who'd been involved with the ensemble, and piecing together the story through interviews and document research. By 2015, the basic outlines of Operation Crescendo had become publicly known within intelligence communities and among journalists who covered espionage history. The operation was discussed in intelligence training programs as an example of creative cover infrastructure, showing how legitimate enterprises could be constructed and operated to provide access for intelligence collection. Security services in countries where the orchestra had performed conducted retrospective reviews of whether they'd missed signs of intelligence activity at the time, generally concluding that the operation had been sophisticated enough that detection would have been extremely difficult without specific tips or reasons to investigate the orchestra's activities. The Pakistani government, when confronted with reports about the Karachi concert having been an intelligence operation, issued statements denying that any foreign intelligence activities had occurred on Pakistani territory and asserting that their security services had been vigilant in monitoring the visiting orchestra. These denials were diplomatically necessary, even though internal Pakistani intelligence assessments acknowledged that Israeli operatives had likely been present during the concert and had conducted surveillance operations. The embarrassment of having hosted an Israeli intelligence operation was significant, but attempting to pursue legal or diplomatic remedies decades after the fact seemed pointless given the impossibility of proving specific violations or identifying individuals who'd been involved. Dr. Rahman, the Pakistani nuclear scientist who'd provided documents during the Karachi concert, was never publicly identified by name or confirmed as having been an Israeli intelligence source. Israeli intelligence maintains protection for sources even long after operations end, understanding that confirming someone's cooperation would endanger them and would discourage future potential sources from agreeing to work with Israeli intelligence. Dr. Rahman's fate remains classified, though intelligence historians speculate that he likely continued providing information until retiring from Pakistan's nuclear program in the mid-1990s, and may have been quietly relocated with a new identity in exchange for his years of cooperation. The question of how effective the orchestra operation was compared to its cost and risk remains debated within intelligence circles. Advocates point to the quality of intelligence gathered, particularly the documents from Dr. Rahman and the surveillance of Pakistani nuclear personnel, arguing that this information couldn't have been obtained through other methods and justified the elaborate infrastructure required. Critics argue that the same resources invested in more conventional intelligence methods, technical surveillance, source recruitment through traditional approaches, cooperation with Western intelligence partners, might have produced comparable intelligence without the operational security risks and the potential diplomatic damage if exposure had occurred earlier or more publicly. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions. The orchestra operation was creative, ambitious, and successful in achieving intelligence objectives that conventional methods struggled with. It provided access to environments and individuals that would have been difficult or impossible to reach through traditional espionage. It demonstrated that cultural programming could serve as effective cover for intelligence work when executed with sufficient attention to detail and operational security. But it was also expensive, operationally complex, psychologically demanding on the personnel involved, and vulnerable to exposure through simple observation or investigation. The operation worked for approximately 4 years before the accumulated risks made continued Operation Unwise, which in intelligence terms is actually a reasonable operational lifespan for this type of program. The psychological impact on the civilian musicians who eventually learned that they'd been unknowing participants in an intelligence operation was varied and complex. Some felt betrayed by the deception, angry that they'd been used without their knowledge or consent for purposes they might not have agreed with if given the choice. Others felt proud to have inadvertently contributed to Israel's security, even if they'd been unaware of doing so at the time. Many had complicated mixed feelings, appreciating that the musical work they'd done was genuine, even if the context surrounding it had been partially manufactured, struggling with questions about whether their performances had been real art or merely operational cover. The broader lesson that Operation Crescendo demonstrated for intelligence agencies worldwide was that the most effective cover is one that isn't cover at all, but rather a legitimate operation that serves dual purposes. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra wasn't a fake orchestra, it was a real orchestra that happened to also be intelligence infrastructure. The concerts weren't pretend performances, they were actual musical events that happened to provide access for intelligence collection. The musicians weren't all pretending, most of them were genuinely performing music, while a subset were conducting intelligence work hidden within legitimate activity. This approach to cover is more sustainable than pure fabrication because there's less to fake, less to maintain, less vulnerability to investigation, revealing inconsistency between claimed purpose and actual activity. Modern intelligence agencies continue to use variations on this approach, though the specific methods evolve with changing technology and geopolitics. Technology companies that actually develop software while providing intelligence services access to networks. Academic research programs that conduct legitimate scientific work while collecting information about foreign technology development. Humanitarian organizations that deliver real assistance while observing conditions in denied areas. The fundamental principle remains constant. The best cover is one that looks legitimate because it is largely legitimate, with intelligence purposes hidden within substantial, genuine activity rather than being poorly disguised fabrications. For the operatives who spent 3 years living as fake musicians, performing concerts across Europe and into Pakistan while conducting intelligence operations, the experience shaped their understanding of identity and authenticity in ways that remained with them long after the operation ended. One former operative, speaking anonymously, in an interview decades later, described the strange cognitive experience of never being entirely sure which version of himself was real, the intelligence officer conducting espionage or the musician performing Brahms in concert halls. He'd spent so much time pretending to be a musician, learning the instrument, practicing the repertoire, living the lifestyle, that the false identity had become partially real through sustained performance. The line between authentic and fabricated had blurred until he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. That psychological complexity is rarely discussed in intelligence histories that focus on operational success rather than human costs, but it's part of the price that deep cover operatives pay for the capabilities they provide, the erosion of stable identity that comes from living extended periods pretending to be someone else so convincingly that the pretense becomes indistinguishable from reality. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra operatives became musicians as much as they pretended to be musicians, and returning to regular intelligence work after years of that deep immersion required psychological adjustment that some found challenging. Somewhere in Israeli intelligence archives, there's a comprehensive file documenting Operation Crescendo, the complete history of planning, execution, intelligence collected, and operational outcomes. The file includes concert programs from every performance, photographs of the orchestra on stage in venues across Europe and Pakistan, intelligence reports based on information gathered during tours, assessments of the operation's effectiveness and security risks, and detailed documentation of how the program was created, operated, and ultimately concluded. The file is classified at levels that ensure it won't be declassified for decades, if ever. But its existence represents the operational history of an orchestra that was both completely real and entirely fictional, depending on whether you measured reality by documentation and performances or by actual purpose and strategic intent. And in the ongoing shadow war where intelligence agencies operate, the concept that Operation Crescendo pioneered, creating entire legitimate enterprises as intelligence infrastructure, continues to define how covert operations are conducted in an era where traditional espionage has given way to operations so sophisticated that the line between legitimate business and intelligence activity becomes indistinguishable by design. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra performed its final concert in June 1991. The civilian musicians received their final paychecks and moved on to other careers, and the infrastructure that had supported nearly 4 years of intelligence operations was quietly dismantled. But the operational techniques it demonstrated, the lessons it taught about creative cover and sustained deception, those continue to influence how intelligence agencies think about access and operational security. The world of espionage is all around us, hidden in plain sight, woven into legitimate activity so thoroughly that distinguishing between normal business operations and intelligence work becomes nearly impossible for outside observers. Cultural programs might serve security purposes. Technology companies might collect more information than their business model requires. Academic exchanges might facilitate intelligence sharing beyond educational objectives. Not all such activities involve intelligence purposes. Most don't, but some do. And the sophistication with which intelligence agencies can construct and operate legitimate-appearing infrastructure means that exposure is rare and confirmation even rarer. The Israeli Chamber Orchestra performed approximately 140 concerts over 4 years, bringing classical music to audiences across Europe and into Pakistan. They received generally positive reviews from music critics who evaluated them as a competent chamber ensemble with good cohesion and respectable technical execution. They represented Israeli culture internationally during a period when such cultural diplomacy served important strategic purposes beyond mere entertainment. Everything about their operation was genuine, except the complete truth about why the orchestra existed and what purposes it served beyond music. That's intelligence work at its most sophisticated, not the dramatic action and violence of Hollywood portrayals, but sustained, patient, meticulous construction of cover so thorough that it becomes reality while simultaneously serving purposes that remain invisible to everyone except those who need to know. Subscribe for more intelligence operations that changed history while hiding in plain sight.